Tonight, we are not telling a story meant to entertain. We are entering a history that must be remembered. In the quiet countryside of occupied Poland, beyond barbed wire and watchtowers, a place was built that would redefine the meaning of human cruelty. Not through chaos, not through rage, but through planning, paperwork, and routine. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not a battlefield. It was a system. Here, trains arrived on schedule. Records were kept with precision. Orders were followed. And within this structure, more than 1 million men, women, and children were murdered, most of them simply because they existed. This documentary examines Auschwitz-Birkenau in full historical context, how it was built, how it functioned, and how an industrial process of genocide was carried out in plain sight of the modern world. We will move slowly, carefully, fact by fact, not to shock, but to understand. Because the Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with language, with laws, with silence. As you listen, take a moment to reflect, not only on what happened here, but on how it was allowed to happen. And before we begin, I invite you to pause for just a moment. Tell me quietly where you're listening from tonight. And if you believe that history matters, that remembrance matters, consider subscribing so these stories are never lost to time. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1, Segment 1. Historical Context. The world that made Birkenau possible. To understand Auschwitz-Birkenau, it is necessary to begin far before its fences were raised, before its barracks were built, and before the first train arrived at its gates. Birkenau did not emerge suddenly or accidentally. It was the result of ideas, policies, and decisions that developed gradually, normalized step by step, within a society that learned to accept exclusion, then persecution, and finally annihilation. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany was a nation marked by defeat, economic collapse, and political instability. The Treaty of Versailles imposed severe territorial losses, military restrictions, and financial reparations. For many Germans, this period became associated with humiliation and resentment. Extremist movements exploited these emotions, offering simple explanations for complex problems and directing anger towards scapegoated groups. Among these movements was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler. From its earliest days, Nazi ideology was built on racial hierarchy. Jews were portrayed not as individuals, but as an abstract threat, blamed for economic hardship, political unrest, cultural decline, and Germany's defeat in war. These ideas were not fringe. They were repeated in speeches, newspapers, classrooms, and public rituals until prejudice began to feel ordinary. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, discrimination was quickly transformed into law. Jewish citizens were dismissed from public service, barred from professions, and excluded from public life. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship entirely, reducing them to subjects without rights. Violence followed policy. During the Kristallnacht pogrom of 1938, synagogues were burned, Jewish businesses destroyed, and thousands of people arrested while authorities largely stood aside. At this stage, the Nazi regime focused primarily on exclusion and forced immigration. Jews were pressured to leave Germany, often stripped of their property in the process. But as the regime expanded through territorial conquest, these policies evolved. With the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the outbreak of World War II, millions of Jews came under Nazi control almost overnight. Ghettos were established in occupied cities, confining entire populations under brutal conditions of overcrowding, starvation, and disease. These ghettos were not intended as permanent solutions. They were holding spaces created while Nazi leadership debated how to deal with what they called the Jewish question. As the war expanded eastward with the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, violence escalated dramatically. Mobile killing units, known as Einsatzgruppen, followed German armies and carried out mass shootings of Jewish communities, Roma, political commissars, and others. Entire villages were erased in forests and ravines. But even this level of violence presented logistical challenges. Mass shootings were psychologically taxing for perpetrators, time-consuming, and difficult to conceal. Nazi leadership sought methods that were more efficient, more controlled, and less visible to the broader population. It was within this context that the concept of industrialized murder took shape. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials met at a villa in Wannsee, near Berlin. The meeting did not initiate genocide, it formalized it. The Wannsee Conference coordinated what was already underway: the systematic deportation and murder of Europe's Jewish population. This plan became known as the final solution. The final solution required infrastructure. It required railways, administrative coordination, and sites capable of handling mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Existing camps were expanded and repurposed. New ones were built in occupied Poland, far from Germany's urban centers, where secrecy could be maintained and victims could be transported from across Europe. Auschwitz began in 1940 as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners. But its location, near major rail lines, distant from Germany, and adjacent to vast areas of land, made it ideal for expansion. In 1941, plans were drawn up for a new camp nearby, Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau. Birkenau was designed not merely as a prison camp, but as a killing center. Its scale reflected the ambition of the final solution. Hundreds of barracks, multiple crematoria, gas chambers capable of killing thousands of people per day, a railway spur that would eventually run directly into the camp itself. What makes this history especially difficult to confront is its administrative nature. Birkenau was not the result of spontaneous hatred alone. It was built through blueprints, budgets, memoranda, and approvals. Engineers calculated capacity. Doctors supervised selections. Clerks recorded numbers. Each role, small on its own, contributed to an immense machinery of death. By the time Birkenau became fully operational, the Nazi regime had spent nearly a decade preparing the ground, ideologically, legally, and psychologically. Ordinary citizens had been taught who belonged and who did not. Bureaucrats had learned to follow orders without questioning outcomes. Violence had been normalized through repetition. Birkenau was not an aberration. It was the culmination of a process. As this chapter continues, we will move from ideology to construction, from ideas to physical reality. We will examine how Birkenau was built, how it functioned, and how human lives were processed within it with chilling efficiency. But it is important to pause here at the beginning to recognize that Auschwitz-Birkenau was made possible not only by hatred, but by compliance, indifference, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. The camp did not appear overnight. It was prepared for, accepted, and then expanded. And once it existed, the world would be forever changed by what took place within. Its fences. Chapter 1, Segment 3. Arrival. For those deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the journey itself was already a descent into disorientation and fear. Families were torn from their homes with little warning. They were told they were being resettled, relocated for work, or transferred for safety. What awaited them was never explained. People were herded into freight cars designed for cargo, not human beings. Dozens, sometimes more than 100, were packed into a single wagon. There were no seats, no toilets, often no windows. The doors were sealed from the outside. The trains moved slowly, Journeys that might have taken hours under normal conditions stretched into days. Food was rarely provided. Water was sometimes handed through cracks, sometimes not at all. Air grew stale. Children cried until they no longer had the strength. Elderly passengers collapsed. The dead remained among the living because there was nowhere to put them, and no one knew where they were going. When the train finally stopped, the doors were thrown open abruptly. Floodlights cut through the darkness. Dogs barked. Guards shouted orders in German. Prisoners were blinded by light, noise, and exhaustion all at once. This was the arrival ramp at Birkenau. People were ordered out quickly. There was no time to orient themselves. Luggage was left behind, often marked with names and addresses, under the false belief it would be returned later. Families instinctively tried to stay together, holding hands, clinging to one another in confusion that SS officers stood nearby, observing. The center of the process was selection. Doctors, often wearing white coats, gestured with a simple movement of the hand. Left, right. The gesture lasted seconds. It determined everything. Those deemed capable of labor were separated from those considered too young, too old, sick, pregnant, or weak. The majority were sent one way. They were told they were going to shower. This deception was deliberate. It reduced panic. It kept the process orderly. Signs in multiple languages reinforced the lie. Guards avoided unnecessary violence at this stage, not out of mercy, but efficiency. Children were often taken from parents in these moments. Mothers clutched infants instinctively. Elderly relatives tried to stay close. Guards intervened when necessary, forcing separations with practiced routine. Those selected for labor were registered, tattooed with numbers, and stripped of their identities. Their names were replaced by digits. Their hair was shaved. Their clothes were taken. They were issued uniforms that did not fit and shoes that caused wounds within days. They entered the camp. Those sent the other way were marched toward buildings that looked unremarkable from the outside. They were not registered. They were not counted as prisoners. In Nazi records, many of them simply ceased to exist. Inside the gas chambers, the lie continued. People were ordered to undress, to hang clothing on hooks, to remember numbers so they could retrieve belongings afterward. These instructions were meant to maintain calm until the final moment. The doors were sealed. What followed was mass murder. Zyklon B pellets were dropped through openings in the ceiling. The gas spread rapidly. Death followed within minutes. The process was repeated again and again, day after day, train after train. The bodies were removed by prisoners forced into Sonderkommando units. These men were compelled to assist in disposing of the dead, under constant threat of execution themselves. They lived in isolation, knowing they would eventually be killed to eliminate witnesses. Crematoria operated continuously. When capacity was exceeded, bodies were burned in open pits. Ash was dumped into nearby rivers, fields, and ponds. Nothing was meant to remain. From the outside, Birkenau continued to function as an administrative complex. Reports were filed. Supplies were replenished. New transports were scheduled. The killing was not chaotic. It was structured. What makes this process especially devastating is its speed. For many deportees, the time between arrival and death was measured in hours. They had no opportunity to understand where they were, to say goodbye, or to resist. Birkenau was designed to ensure that. And yet, even within this system, fragments of humanity persisted. People whispered reassurances to children. Parents tried to memorize faces. Some prayed. Some sang softly. Some simply held on to one another as long as possible. These moments did not change the outcome, but they mattered. They remind us that those murdered at Birkenau were not anonymous victims of an abstract system. They were individuals, each with a life that existed before the ramp, before the train, before the LIB, by the end of 1942, Birkenau had become the central site of the final solution. Its arrival process was refined to maximize speed and minimize resistance. Deportations increased. Entire communities disappeared. The ramp was the threshold on one side, the world people knew on the other, a system designed to erase them. In the next chapter, we will examine how Birkenau functioned after arrival, the daily life of those forced to survive inside the camp, and the constant presence of death that shaped every moment. What happened after selection did not offer safety, only delay. Chapter 1, Segment 2. From Policy to Place. By the time Auschwitz-Birkenau was conceived, the Nazi state had already demonstrated how ideology could be transformed into routine administration. What remained was to give that administration a physical form. Birkenau was not imagined in isolation. It emerged from a broader system of camps, offices, railways, and ministries that together converted abstract hatred into operational reality. In occupied Poland, Nazi authorities searched for locations that met specific criteria. The site needed to be distant from Germany's civilian population, yet connected to Europe's rail network. It needed space for expansion, access to raw materials, and proximity to forced labor pools. It also needed to exist in a zone where secrecy could be enforced and witnesses could be silenced. The area near the town of Auschwitz met those requirements. Originally, Auschwitz had been established in former Polish army barracks to imprison political opponents and resistance members. As deportations increased and Nazi ambitions expanded, this camp proved insufficient. In 1941, Heinrich Himmler approved the construction of a much larger facility nearby. This new camp would be called Auschwitz II Birkenau. The planning documents describe Birkenau in neutral, technical language. Capacity figures replaced human beings. Timelines replaced lives. The camp was divided into sections, each designated by letters and numbers. Barracks were standardized. Roads were measured. Drainage was calculated. The purpose behind these details was not hidden, but it was rarely named directly. Construction began using forced labor. Prisoners were compelled to build the very structures that would later be used to imprison and kill others, and often themselves. The work was exhausting and dangerous. Malnutrition, exposure, and beatings were common. Many died before the camp was even completed. The early design of Birkenau reflected the evolving nature of Nazi killing methods. At first, mass murder relied heavily on shootings and improvised gas vans. But these approaches were deemed inefficient. Birkenau would solve that problem by integrating murder into the camp's architecture itself. Gas chambers were built to resemble ordinary buildings. Crematoria were designed to operate continuously. Ventilation systems were installed not for comfort, but for faster killing. Ash disposal was planned alongside transport schedules. Every element was engineered to serve a single function. That as construction continued, deportations accelerated. Trains arrived from across occupied Europe. Jews from Poland, France, the Netherlands, Greece, Hungary, and countless other regions were loaded into freight cars. The journey often lasted days. Water was scarce. Air was limited. Many arrived already weakened or dead. The camp expanded in response. New barracks were added. More guards were stationed. Administrative offices multiplied. Paperwork flowed steadily, documenting arrivals, transfers, and deaths with chilling regularity. The people overseeing this expansion did not view themselves as murderers in the traditional sense. They saw themselves as managers, logisticians, professionals performing assigned duties. Responsibility was fragmented. No single individual was tasked with witnessing the entire process from beginning to end. This fragmentation was crucial that IT allowed moral distance. Engineers focused on construction. Doctors focused on selection. Clerks focused on records. Guards focused on control. Each role could be rationalized as technical rather than ethical. Birkenau's location also served another purpose: isolation. Surrounded by fields, forests, and barbed wire, the camp existed largely beyond the view of the outside world. Local populations were restricted. Prisoners were forbidden from communicating. Even many Germans had only vague notions of what occurred there. Rumors circulated, but clarity was rare. The Nazis relied on this ambiguity. Secrecy reduced resistance. Distance diluted responsibility. The camp became a space where actions that would have been unthinkable elsewhere could proceed without interruption. As Birkenau grew, its function shifted decisively. While forced labor remained part of the system, extermination became central. The camp was no longer merely a place of detention or exploitation. It was a site designed to kill at scale. This transition was not marked by a single announcement. It unfolded gradually, embedded in daily routines. Trains arrived more frequently. Selections became faster. The majority of those deported were never registered as prisoners at all. They were murdered shortly after arrival. Yet, even as killing intensified, the administrative tone remained unchanged. Reports were filed. Statistics were updated. Supplies were requisitioned. The machinery of the state continued to function as if engaged in ordinary governance. What makes Birkenau especially significant is not only the scale of death, but the normalization of its operation. Murder was not presented as an exception. It became a process, a schedule, a workflow. By late 1942, Birkenau had reached a level of efficiency that matched the ambitions of the final solution. Its expansion reflected the full integration of genocide into state policy. The camp was no longer simply being built at IT, was being perfected at IN. The next segment, we will turn to the moment when human beings first encountered this perfected system. The arrival process, the selections, and the immediate decisions that determined who would live briefly longer and who would die within hours. This is where ideology met bodies, where planning met reality, and where Birkenau revealed its true purpose. Chapter 2, Segment 1. Inside the camp, life measured in survival. For those who survived selection and were admitted into Auschwitz-Birkenau as prisoners, survival did not mean safety. It meant entry into a world governed by deprivation, fear, and constant proximity to death. Every aspect of daily life inside the camp was designed to weaken the body and erode the mind, reducing individuals to a state where endurance itself became an act of resistance. Prisoners arrived exhausted, malnourished, and disoriented. They were immediately stripped of their remaining possessions and any visible signs of personal identity. Hair was shaved. Names were replaced with numbers tattooed onto forearms. Clothing was exchanged for thin, striped uniforms, often mismatched and unsuitable for the harsh Polish climate. Shoes rarely fit, causing wounds that easily became infected. The barracks at Birkenau were overcrowded beyond their intended capacity. Wooden bunks were stacked in tiers, each designed for a single person but shared by several. Straw mattresses were thin or non-existent. Lice and disease spread rapidly. There was little protection from cold in winter or heat in summer. Sanitation facilities were minimal, leading to outbreaks of dysentery and typhus. Each morning began before dawn with roll call. Prisoners were forced to stand outside for hours, regardless of weather, while guards counted and recounted them. Those who collapsed were beaten or dragged away. If numbers did not match, the entire block could be punished, forced to remain standing even longer until discrepancies were resolved. Food was deliberately insufficient. Daily rations consisted of watery soup, a small piece of bread, and occasionally a thin slice of sausage or margarine. The calories provided were far below what was required for survival, especially given the physical labor demanded. Hunger became a constant presence, shaping thoughts, dreams, and behavior. Forced labor assignments varied. Some prisoners worked in construction, expanding the camp itself. Others labored in nearby factories, farms, or industrial sites operated by German companies that profited directly from camp labor. Work was exhausting, often pointless, and always dangerous. Injuries were common. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. Those deemed unable to work were sent to the gas chambers during periodic selections conducted within the camp. SS doctors inspected prisoners, looking for signs of weakness. Illness, weight loss, or injury could mean death. Survival required appearing strong, even when the body was failing. Violence was woven into daily routine. Guards enforced discipline through beatings, humiliation, and arbitrary punishment. Prisoner functionaries, known as capos, were often placed in positions of authority over others, creating a hierarchy that fostered mistrust and competition. Acts of cruelty were encouraged as a means of maintaining control. Yet amid this brutality, moments of solidarity emerged. Prisoners shared crumbs of bread. They whispered stories from home. They offered quiet comfort to those who were ill. These acts carried great risk, but they preserved fragments of humanity within an environment designed to erase it. Death was omnipresent. Smoke from the crematoria drifted across the camp. The smell of burning bodies was inescapable. Prisoners quickly learned that friends who disappeared were unlikely to return. Grief became muted, not from lack of feeling, but from a necessity of emotional survival. Children who had survived initial selection faced particularly grim prospects. Most were murdered shortly after arrival. Those who remained were often subjected to medical experiments or forced labor beyond their capacity. Their presence underscored the complete abandonment of moral restraint within the camp. Time lost its usual meaning in Birkenau. Days blended together, marked only by roll calls, labor, and hunger. Prisoners focused on immediate needs, staying upright, finding warmth, avoiding attention. Long-term hope was dangerous, yet the instinct to survive persisted even under overwhelming odds. This daily existence was not accidental. It was carefully engineered. Starvation weakened resistance. Exhaustion increased compliance. Fear prevented rebellion. Birkenau functioned not only as a killing center, but as a system of total domination. Despite this, survival itself became a form of defiance. Each day endured contradicted the camp's purpose. Each memory preserved resisted erasure. In the next segment, we will examine how the machinery of death operated alongside daily life. The crematoria, the Sonderkommando units, and the efforts made by the Nazis to conceal their crimes even as they carried them out. The camp was not divided into life and death. It was a place where both existed simultaneously, intertwined in every moment. Chapter 2, Segment 2, The Machinery of Death. While daily life at Auschwitz-Birkenau revolved around hunger, labor, and exhaustion, it unfolded alongside a parallel system whose sole purpose was mass murder. This system did not operate in secret from those inside the camp. It was visible, audible, and unavoidable. Prisoners lived within sight of the mechanisms that killed thousands every day. The center of this machinery were the gas chambers and crematoria. Birkenau eventually contained 4 large crematoria complexes, each equipped with underground undressing rooms, gas chambers disguised as shower facilities, and furnaces designed to burn bodies continuously. These structures were built to handle mass murder on an industrial scale. Their placement, construction, and operation reflected careful planning rather than improvisation. The process followed a routine. After selection on the arrival ramp, those marked for death were marched to the crematoria. Guards maintained order through deception and intimidation. Victims were told to remember where they hung their clothes, to stay calm, to follow instructions. This strategy reduced panic and resistance, allowing the process to continue efficiently. Once inside the gas chambers, the doors were sealed. Zyklon B, a pesticide containing hydrogen cyanide, was introduced through openings in the ceiling. Within minutes, those inside were dead. The chambers were ventilated and the bodies removed. This task was carried out by prisoners assigned to Sonderkommando units. Sonderkommando members were Jewish prisoners forced to work in the crematoria. Their roles included guiding victims, removing bodies, extracting gold teeth, cutting hair, and operating the furnaces. They were isolated from the rest of the camp and lived under constant threat of execution. The Nazis intended to eliminate witnesses. Sonderkommando units were periodically killed and replaced. This ensured that those who knew the most about the killing process would not survive long enough to testify. Despite this, some managed to leave behind written accounts, burying notes near the crematoria in desperate attempts to preserve evidence. Cremation was relentless. When furnaces could not keep pace with arrivals, bodies were burned in open pits. Flames lit the night sky. Ash fell like dust across the camp. Human remains were dumped into rivers, fields, and ponds, intended to disappear without trace. The scale was staggering. T-peak periods. Birkenau murdered thousands of people per day. Entire transports were annihilated within hours of arrival. Records were incomplete by design. Many victims were never registered, leaving families without confirmation of death. The proximity of death shaped every aspect of camp life. Prisoners heard screams, smelled burning flesh, and watched smoke rise continuously. Survival meant learning to exist alongside this reality without collapsing under its weight. For the SS, the killing process became routine. Officers rotated shifts. Clerks tracked numbers. Doctors refined selection criteria. The language used avoided explicit reference to murder. Victims were referred to as units or pieces. This bureaucratic framing allowed perpetrators to distance themselves emotionally from their actions. Yet the psychological toll was not absent. Some SS personnel requested transfers. Others turned to alcohol, but the system itself did not pause. Individual discomfort never outweighed institutional momentum. The machinery of death was supported by a vast logistical network. Railways delivered victims. Factories supplied Zyklon B. Companies designed and built crematoria. Local industries benefited from forced labor. The genocide depended on cooperation across sectors, blurring the line between perpetrator and participant. Resistance within this system was extraordinarily difficult. Any attempt to disrupt operations risked immediate death. Still, acts of defiance occurred. Prisoners sabotaged equipment when possible. Information was smuggled to the outside world. And in October 1944, members of the Sonderkommando staged an uprising, destroying one crematorium before being brutally suppressed. These acts did not stop the killings, but they mattered. They demonstrated that even within the most controlled environment imaginable, human beings resisted annihilation when possible. They refused to disappear silently as Allied forces advanced and defeat became inevitable. The Nazis attempted to erase evidence of their crimes. Documents were destroyed. Crematoria were dismantled. Bodies were exhumed and burned. Yet the scale of murder could not be fully concealed. The machinery of death left marks too deep to erase. In the next segment, we will turn to the final months of Birkenau's operation. the evacuations, the death marches, and the liberation that revealed the camp to the world. What was uncovered did not merely expose a crime. It forced humanity to confront what had been done in its name. Chapter 2, Segment 3. Daily Existence Inside Birkenau. For those who were not murdered immediately upon arrival, life inside Auschwitz-Birkenau became a slow, grinding confrontation with exhaustion, fear, and constant uncertainty. Survival was not shaped by strength alone. It depended on chance, timing, and the smallest shifts in circumstance. Every day began and ended under the shadow of death. Morning started before dawn. Prisoners were forced from their bunks by shouting, whistles, and blows. Barracks were overcrowded beyond capacity. Wooden bunks were stacked 3 levels high, often holding 4 or 5 people per level. There were no mattresses. Straw, if present at all, was infested with lice. Sleep was shallow and fragmented, interrupted by cold, illness, and the constant movement of bodies. Roll call followed. Prisoners stood outside for hours, regardless of weather. Rain, snow, and freezing winds were endured in silence. Anyone who collapsed was beaten or dragged away. The count had to match perfectly. If a prisoner had died overnight, their body was propped upright to be counted among the living. Only after roll call did work assignments begin. Birkenau functioned as a labor reservoir for the Nazi war economy. Prisoners were sent to construction sites, factories, farms, and nearby industrial complexes. Others were forced to expand the camp itself, digging drainage ditches, laying roads, and building new barracks. Labor was intentionally brutal. Exhaustion was not a side effect. It was a tool. Food was scarce and nutritionally meaningless. A typical daily ration consisted of watery soup, a small piece of bread, and occasionally a sliver of margarine or sausage substitute. Starvation weakened immune systems, slowed thinking, and made even simple movements painful. Prisoners spoke of dreaming about food constantly. Hunger became a permanent companion. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other illnesses thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Medical care was minimal or non-existent. The camp infirmary often served as another site of selection. Those deemed too weak to recover were sent to the gas chambers. Fear governed relationships. Trust was fragile. Informants existed. Desperation sometimes drove prisoners to steal from one another. Yet moments of solidarity also emerged. Prisoners shared scraps of food, whispered warnings, and offered quiet comfort. These small acts carried enormous emotional weight in a place designed to erase humanity. Punishment was arbitrary and public. Minor infractions could result in beatings, torture, or execution. Prisoners were hanged or shot in front of others as a warning. Collective punishment was common. Entire blocks could be deprived of food or forced to stand for hours because of one person's mistake. Children faced particular cruelty. Those not murdered upon arrival were often separated from parents, subjected to medical experiments, or forced into labor beyond their physical capacity. Survival rates were low. Childhood in Birkenau was measured in days. Women endured additional abuses, sexual violence, forced sterilization, and exploitation were widespread. Pregnant women were almost always killed. Mothers who attempted to hide children faced certain death if discovered. The psychological toll was immense. Prisoners described a numbing of emotion. Detachment became a survival mechanism. To grieve openly was dangerous. To hope too strongly was painful. Many learned to exist moment by moment, focusing only on the next hour, the next task, the next breath. Time itself felt distorted. Days blended together. Seasons passed almost unnoticed. The outside world became distant, unreal. For many, survival meant forgetting who they had been before arrival. Yet even here, fragments of identity survived. Some prisoners recited poetry silently. Others remembered family names, birthdays, or songs. Religious rituals were practiced in secret. These acts were quiet defiance. They asserted that the camp did not fully own the inner lives of its prisoners. Death was omnipresent. Corpses were a daily sight. Prisoners stepped over bodies on the way to work. The smell of burning flesh never fully faded. Smoke from the crematoria marked time as reliably as the sun. And still, people endured, not because life was bearable, but because the instinct to survive persisted even in conditions designed to extinguish it. Survival itself became an act of resistance. 1944 turned into 1945. The rhythm of Birkenau began to shift. The front lines moved closer. The camp's role changed from a place of arrival to a place of evacuation. In the next chapter, we will examine how the Nazis responded to impending defeat and how Birkenau's final months unfolded in chaos, cruelty, and desperation. The end of the camp did not mean the end of suffering. For many, it marked the beginning of a final ordeal. Chapter 3, Segment 1, Crematoria, Gas Chambers, and the Machinery of Death. By 1943, Auschwitz-Birkenau had fully transformed into the central engine of Nazi mass murder. What began as a network of detention and labor camps evolved into a highly organized system designed for one purpose above all others: industrialized extermination. At the center of this system stood the gas chambers and crematoria, structures engineered not only for killing, but for speed, efficiency, and concealment. Birkenau contained four main crematoria complexes, known as Crematoria 2, 3, 4, and V. Each facility combined undressing rooms, gas chambers, furnaces, and auxiliary spaces into a single, integrated killing process. Victims were not meant to see the full sequence. Confusion, deception, and haste were deliberate tools. Upon arrival for special treatment, prisoners were led toward the crematoria under the pretense of disinfection or showers. Signs, hooks for clothing, and instructions reinforced the illusion. Families were told to remember their coat numbers. Mothers were urged to keep children calm. SS guards maintained a rehearsed tone of order. The gas chambers themselves were disguised as communal bathhouses. Fake shower heads lined the ceilings. Benches were placed along the walls. Once the doors were sealed, Zyklon B pellets, a cyanide-based pesticide, were introduced through vents or openings in the roof. Within minutes, the gas filled the room. Death followed quickly, but not peacefully. Witnesses later described screaming, clawing, and frantic attempts to reach air. Children were often lifted upward by adults trying to save them. The strongest survived the longest, pressed against walls or doors in a desperate search for oxygen. After approximately 15 to 20 minutes, silence returned. Ventilation systems cleared the chambers. Then came the work of the Sonderkommando. These were prisoners, almost entirely Jewish men, forced to assist in the extermination process. They removed bodies, cut hair, extracted gold teeth, and prepared corpses for cremation. Their labor was conducted under constant threat of death. Sonderkommando units were regularly killed and replaced to eliminate witnesses. The crematoria furnaces operated day and night. Each oven could incinerate multiple bodies at once. When capacity was exceeded, bodies were burned in open pits behind the buildings. Flames rose into the sky, visible across the camp. Ash fell like snow. Rivers and fields were contaminated with human remains. The scale was unprecedented. T-peak operation. Birkenau could murder and dispose of thousands of people per day. The process was bureaucratic. Timetables were kept. Transport schedules were coordinated. Efficiency reports were filed. Murder became administrative routine. Yet even this system had limits. Mechanical failures, fuel shortages, and sheer volume strained the infrastructure. Smoke and stench drifted beyond the camp, reaching nearby villages. Rumors spread. Prisoners arriving later increasingly understood the truth. The Nazis responded with secrecy and acceleration. As Allied forces advanced, SS leadership sought to erase evidence. Records were destroyed. Crematoria 4 and V were dismantled. Ash was dumped into rivers or buried. Open-air burnings increased to eliminate backlogs. Despite the attempt at concealment, traces remained, fragments of bone, layers of ash, survivors who lived to testify. Inside the camp, awareness of the extermination process shaped every interaction. Prisoners learned to read subtle signals, transport lists, sudden movements, the direction of smoke. Survival sometimes hinged on avoiding a single selection, a single line, a single moment of attention. Resistance, even here, existed. Sonderkommando prisoners secretly documented the killings. Photographs were smuggled. Notes were buried in jars near the crematoria. These records would later serve as crucial historical evidence that, in October 1944, desperation reached a breaking point. Members of the Sonderkommando staged an uprising, destroying crematorium for using explosives smuggled from munitions factory by women prisoners. Though the revolt was crushed and most participants were killed, the act stood as one of the few armed resistances within Birkenau itself. The machinery of death continued, but the illusion of total control was cracking. As the war turned decisively against Nazi Germany, Birkenau entered its final phase, one defined not by arrival, but by evacuation, destruction, and abandonment that I end the next segment. We will examine how the Nazis attempted to empty the camp, what became known as the Death Marches. In the final days before liberation, the end of Birkenau was approaching. For many prisoners, survival would depend on enduring one last ordeal beyond the camp's fences. Chapter 3, Segment 2. Daily life inside Birkenau. Survival within a system designed to kill. Life inside Auschwitz-Birkenau existed in constant contradiction. It was a place engineered for mass death, yet tens of thousands of prisoners were kept alive, not out of mercy, but because their bodies were still useful. Survival was never the goal of the system. Survival was an accident, a temporary condition that could end at any moment. For those not immediately selected for death, existence settled into a routine of exhaustion, hunger, fear, and uncertainty. Every day followed a rigid structure enforced by violence. Roll calls, labor assignments, inspections, and punishments were repeated endlessly, creating a rhythm that slowly stripped people of individuality and hope. Mornings began before dawn. Prisoners were forced out of overcrowded barracks regardless of weather. In winter, temperatures dropped far below freezing. Clothing was thin. Shoes were often mismatched or non-existent. Frostbite and illness spread rapidly. Standing for hours during roll call, motionless and silent, many collapsed before the day even began. Roll calls were acts of domination. Prisoners stood in rows while SS guards counted and recounted bodies. The dead were dragged from bunks and propped upright to be included in the count. Any discrepancy could result in hours of punishment. Entire blocks were sometimes forced to stand until numbers matched, regardless of illness or death. After roll call came labor. Birkenau functioned as a reservoir of forced labor for the Nazi war machine. Prisoners were assigned to construction, agriculture, factories, road building, or internal camp duties. Workdays stretched 12 hours or more. Food rations were insufficient for survival, let alone labor. Starvation was systematic. Meals consisted of watery soup, small portions of bread, and occasional substitutes that offered little nutrition. Hunger was constant. Prisoners dreamed of food. Conversations revolved around recipes, memories of meals, fantasies of abundance. Hunger reshaped morality. Theft became common. Compassion competed with survival. Disease flourished. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, contaminated water, and malnutrition created perfect conditions for illness. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and infections spread unchecked. Medical care was minimal and often lethal. The camp infirmary was feared as much as it was hoped for. Doctors within Birkenau were instruments of selection that SS physicians conducted routine examinations that determined who was fit to work and who would be sent to the gas chambers. Illness, injury, or weakness could mean death. Prisoners learned to hide symptoms, to stand upright despite pain, to appear stronger than they were. Children rarely survived long. Those too young to work were usually killed upon arrival. Older children sometimes survived briefly if they appeared useful. Their lives were marked by confusion and terror, separated from parents, forced to mature instantly or perish. Violence was omnipresent. Beatings occurred without warning. Guards exercised absolute power. Punishments were arbitrary. A glance, a stumble, a misunderstanding could provoke lethal force. Public executions were used to enforce obedience. Fear was constant and deliberate. Yet within this environment, fragments of humanity endured. Prisoners formed bonds, shared crumbs of food, whispered prayers, and exchanged information. Acts of kindness, however small, became lifelines. A warning about an inspection, a piece of bread hidden for later, a moment of shared silence. Spiritual resistance persisted. Religious observances were conducted in secret. Songs were remembered. Stories were told. Cultural identity became an act of defiance. Remembering who one was before Birkenau became a way to resist being reduced to a number. Women faced particular horrors. Pregnancy often meant immediate death. Mothers hid children. Sexual violence occurred, though it was rarely spoken of. Female prisoners also played key roles in resistance, smuggling explosives, passing messages, and sustaining networks of support. Time lost meaning. Days blurred together. Seasons passed unnoticed. The future shrank to the next roll call, the next meal, the next night survived. Many prisoners described living moment to moment, unable to imagine life beyond the wire. Still, rumors spread. News of Allied advances filtered through whispers. Guards grew tense. Transport slowed. Some prisoners dared to hope. Others feared retaliation. The camp felt increasingly unstable. By late 1944, it was clear that Birkenau could not continue as it had. The Nazis began preparing for evacuation. Prisoners sensed change in the air, hurried orders, destruction of records, dismantling of equipment. Survival now meant enduring not just Birkenau, but what came after it. In the next segment, we will examine resistance within the camp, the limits of defiance, and how prisoners fought back, not to win, but to leave a record, to reclaim dignity, and to ensure the world would one day know what happened here. Even in a place built for erasure, memory survived. Chapter 3, Segment 3, Resistance in Birkenau, Defiance inside a system built to erase. Resistance inside Auschwitz-Birkenau did not look like open rebellion. It cannot. The camp was designed to make resistance impossible. Through starvation, isolation, terror, and the constant threat of collective punishment. And yet, resistance existed. Quietly, secretly, persistently. It took forms that were often invisible, easily overlooked, but profoundly dangerous resistant Birkenau was to risk everything. The most basic act of resistance was survival itself. Each day a prisoner remained alive was a failure of the system's intent. Enduring hunger, standing through roll call, hiding illness, helping another prisoner stand when they could not. These were not heroic gestures in the traditional sense, but in Birkenau, they were acts of defiance. Organized resistance was rare, but it did exist. Small underground networks formed among prisoners of different nationalities and backgrounds. These networks passed information, shared stolen supplies, and attempted to document crimes. Messages were smuggled out of the camp when possible. Names were memorized. Dates were recorded. Survivors later testified that remembering details was itself a form of rebellion, a way to ensure the truth could not be completely destroyed. The most dangerous resistance came from within the Sonderkommando. The Sonderkommando were prisoners forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria. They removed bodies, extracted valuables, and operated the machinery of mass murder. They lived under constant threat of execution, routinely killed and replaced to eliminate witnesses. Their existence was meant to be temporary and silent, but they were neither passive nor unaware. The Sonderkommando understood the full scope of the extermination process. They knew that their own deaths were inevitable. This knowledge created a terrible clarity. Some began planning not for survival, but for testimony and revolt. They secretly documented what they saw. Written accounts were buried near crematoria, sealed in containers, hidden beneath ash and soil. These writings described the mechanics of killing in careful detail. Many of these documents were recovered after the war. They remain among the most important first-hand records of the Holocaust. Weapons were impossible to obtain. Still, prisoners found ways to resist. Women working in nearby factories smuggled gunpowder in tiny amounts, hidden in clothing or hair. It took months to accumulate enough material to attempt sabotage. Each transfer risked death. In October 1944, resistance reached its breaking point. Members of the Sonderkommando launched an uprising. They attacked guards with improvised weapons. Crematorium 4 was damaged and partially destroyed. Fires broke out. For a brief moment, control was disrupted. The revolt was quickly crushed. SS forces responded with overwhelming violence. Hundreds of prisoners were killed. The leaders of the uprising were executed. The surviving Sonderkommando were later murdered. Militarily, the uprising failed, but historically, it mattered. It proved that even within the most controlled killing center in history, resistance was possible. It shattered the Nazi narrative that victims went silently to their deaths. It left physical and documentary evidence that the Nazis had desperately tried to erase. Other forms of resistance continued. Prisoners sabotaged machinery. They worked slowly. They damaged equipment subtly. They shared information across blocks. They protected children when possible. They taught one another languages, songs, and prayers in whispers. Cultural resistance endured. Songs were remembered. Stories were told. Poems were composed and memorized. Maintaining identity in a place designed to reduce people to numbers was an act of courage. Faith in many forms. Chapter 4, Segment 2. Life inside Birkenau. Survival in a world built for death. For those not immediately killed upon arrival, life inside Auschwitz-Birkenau unfolded as a slow erosion of the body, the mind, and the self. Survival was never guaranteed. It was provisional, fragile, and dependent on countless variables beyond individual control. Hunger, exhaustion, disease, violence, and randomness governed every day. Time itself lost its familiar shape, measured not by clocks or calendars, but by roll calls, labor shifts, and the constant presence of death. Prisoners were housed in wooden barracks originally designed for animals, not human beings. Each barrack held hundreds of people packed tightly together, sleeping on wooden bunks stacked 3 levels high. There was little insulation from the cold in winter or the heat in summer. Rain leaked through roofs. Mud covered the ground. Lice and rats were constant companions. Privacy did not exist. Even the act of breathing felt crowded. Food was deliberately insufficient. Daily rations consisted of watery soup, a small piece of bread, and sometimes a scrap of margarine or sausage. The calories provided were far below what was required to sustain life, especially for those performing exhausting physical labor. Hunger became a constant presence, shaping every thought and decision. Prisoners spoke of dreaming about food, stealing scraps, and measuring survival in weeks rather than years. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making disease inevitable. Forced labor was central to Birkenau's operation. Those selected as fit for work were assigned to construction projects, factories, agricultural labor, or internal camp duties. Prisoners worked from before dawn until nightfall, regardless of weather or physical condition. Beatings were common. Falling behind or collapsing from exhaustion could result in immediate execution. Work was not meant to rehabilitate or reform. It was meant to extract the last possible value from a human body before discarding it. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and other illnesses thrived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Medical care was minimal and often harmful. Nazi doctors conducted experiments on prisoners without consent, treating them as disposable test subjects rather than patients. Being sent to the infirmary could mean temporary relief, or it could mean selection for death. Many prisoners avoided medical blocks out of fear. Roll calls, known as appel, were another tool of control and punishment. Prisoners were forced to stand outside for hours, sometimes in freezing temperatures or driving rain, while SS guards counted and recounted them. Bodies of those who had died overnight were often propped upright to be counted as well. These rituals reinforced the message that even death did not grant escape from the system. Violence permeated daily life. SS guards exercised absolute power and often inflicted cruelty arbitrarily. Capos, prisoners assigned supervisory roles, sometimes abused others in an effort to survive longer themselves. The camp environment eroded moral boundaries, forcing impossible choices. Acts of kindness existed, but they were rare and risky. Sharing food or helping another prisoner could mean death. Yet even within this environment, traces of humanity persisted. Prisoners formed quiet bonds, shared whispered stories, and clung to memories of life before the camp. Some found strength in religion, others in friendship, others simply in the determination to see one more sunrise. These small acts of resistance, remembering a name, refusing to give up hope entirely, were profoundly meaningful in a place designed to erase individuality. Children, though few survived long in Birkenau, experienced the camp differently. Many were killed immediately upon arrival. Those who lived were often used for medical experiments or assigned to light labor. Their presence was a constant reminder of the totality of the Nazi project. No age was spared. Innocence offered no protection. Women faced additional horrors. Sexual violence, forced sterilization, and exploitation were common. Mothers were often separated from their children within minutes of arrival, a trauma that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Pregnancy was treated as a crime punishable by death. The camp sought not only to kill bodies, but to extinguish future generations. Psychologically, Birkenau dismantled identity. Names were replaced with numbers tattooed on arms. Hair was shaved. Personal belongings were confiscated. Prisoners became units of labor rather than individuals. This process of dehumanization was intentional. It made violence easier to carry out and harder to resist. When people are stripped of their identity, their suffering becomes easier to ignore. Despite this, testimonies from survivors consistently emphasize that the will to live, however faint, remained powerful. Survival was often described as a series of small decisions: to stand up when ordered, to conserve energy, to avoid drawing attention, to remember who you were before the camp. These choices did not guarantee survival, but they gave it a chance. Birkenau was not only a place of mass murder. It was a place where human endurance was tested beyond limits most societies can imagine. Those who survived did not do so because the system allowed mercy, but because they found ways, sometimes accidental, sometimes intentional, to endure a world that offered none. In the next segment, we will examine the moments when prisoners resisted this system openly. Acts of defiance were rare and brutally punished, yet they occurred. These acts remind us that even in the darkest conditions, resistance remained possible, and that the story of Birkenau is not only one of death, but also of courage in the face of annihilation. Chapter 4, Segment 1. The Machinery of Death. How Birkenau was designed to kill. By the time Auschwitz-Birkenau reached its full operational scale, it was no longer merely a prison camp, nor even a forced labor site. It had become an industrialized system of death, engineered with precision, secrecy, and bureaucratic efficiency. Every structure, every railway spur, every administrative document served a single purpose: the rapid and systematic murder of human beings. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, shaped by Nazi ideology, wartime urgency, and the chilling belief that genocide could be optimized like any other industrial process. That Birkenau's most infamous structures were its crematoria and gas chambers. But these buildings were only the visible endpoints of a much larger system. The process began far from the camp itself, with deportation lists drawn up in occupied countries across Europe. Entire families were ordered onto trains under the guise of resettlement or labor in the East. The victims were allowed to bring luggage, food, and personal belongings, reinforcing the illusion that they were being relocated rather than condemned. This deception was deliberate. Panic, resistance, or mass refusal would have disrupted the system. Calm compliance ensured efficiency. Upon arrival at Birkenau, transports were met by SS personnel trained to maintain order and control. The camp's railway ramp was designed to handle thousands of arrivals at once. Loud commands, barking dogs, and the presence of armed guards created confusion and fear, yet the process moved quickly. Prisoners were separated by gender and age within minutes. The elderly, the sick, mothers with young children, and anyone deemed unable to work were sent in one direction. Those selected for forced labor were sent in another. Most victims never understood that this brief moment decided whether they would live for weeks or months longer, or be killed within hours. The crematoria complexes at Birkenau were constructed to support this volume of killing. Unlike earlier killing sites that relied on mass shootings or mobile gas vans, Birkenau's facilities were permanent, large-scale, and concealed behind layers of euphemistic language and architectural disguise. Gas chambers were often presented as shower rooms. Signs, benches, and hooks for clothing were installed to maintain the illusion. Victims were told they were undergoing delousing before being assigned to work. Even in these final moments, the Nazi system relied on lies. The killing itself was carried out using Zyklon B, a pesticide originally developed for pest control. Its use in Birkenau was the result of deliberate experimentation aimed at finding the most effective method of mass murder. Once the gas was released, SS guards sealed the doors and waited. What followed was death by asphyxiation, occurring out of sight and deliberately removed from the perpetrator's immediate experience. This physical distance between killer and victim was a critical psychological element. It allowed ordinary men to participate in genocide while avoiding direct confrontation with the suffering they caused. After the killing, the process continued with equal coldness. Special prisoner units, known as Sonderkommando, were forced to remove bodies from the gas chambers, extract valuables such as gold teeth, and transport the dead to the crematoria. These prisoners were themselves victims, coerced under threat of death, and replaced regularly to prevent survivors from bearing witness. Their labor was an essential part of the machinery, and their existence underscored the depth of moral collapse within the system. Survival required participation in the unthinkable. The crematoria operated day and night during peak periods. When they could no longer keep pace with the number of bodies, open-air burning pits were used. Smoke and ash filled the air, visible for miles around. Local residents could smell the burning and see the glow at night. Yet the true scale of what was happening remained largely unspoken. The Nazi regime depended not only on secrecy, but on silence, on the human tendency to look away from horrors that defy comprehension. Behind the scenes, meticulous records were kept. Transports were logged. Numbers were counted. Efficiency reports were filed. At the same time, efforts were made to destroy evidence. Ashes were dumped into rivers, ponds, and fields. Documents were altered or burned. Language was carefully chosen to obscure reality. Murder became special treatment. Deportation became evacuation. The bureaucratic nature of the system allowed genocide to be carried out by clerks, engineers, doctors, and administrators who never personally lifted a weapon. What makes Birkenau uniquely terrifying is not only the scale of the killing, but the intent behind its design. This was not chaos. It was planning. It was policy. It was the deliberate application of modern technology, organization, and state power to eliminate entire populations. The camp functioned as both a physical place and an idea, proof that a society can descend into mass murder while maintaining the appearance of order. Understanding this machinery of death is essential, not to dwell on horror, but to recognize how easily human systems can be twisted when ideology replaces empathy and obedience replaces conscience. Birkenau did not exist in isolation. It was supported by governments, industries, transportation networks, and ordinary citizens who chose compliance over resistance. The crematoria were only the final link in a long chain of decisions that in the next segment. We will turn away from the structures and systems and focus instead on the human beings trapped within them. Those who endured daily life under the constant shadow of death, and whose survival, however brief, stand as an act of defiance against a world determined to erase them. Chapter 4, Segment 3, Resistance, Defiance, and the Limits of Survival. Auschwitz-Birkenau was engineered to eliminate resistance. Its structure, surveillance, brutality, and constant terror were designed to leave no room for organized defiance. And yet, resistance existed. It took many forms, most of them quiet and nearly invisible, shaped by the reality that open rebellion almost always meant immediate death. In a place built to extinguish human will, even the smallest act of refusal carried extraordinary weight. For most prisoners, resistance began internally. It meant refusing to surrender one's identity completely, remembering a name, holding on to a memory of family, of language, of faith, of music, of life before the camp. Survivors later describe how recalling birthdays, reciting poems, or silently repeating prayers became acts of defiance. These were ways of asserting that they were still human in a system determined to erase them. There were also practical forms of resistance woven into daily survival. Prisoners sabotaged work assignments when possible, damaging machinery, slowing production, or miscounting materials. These acts were dangerous. Discovery often resulted in execution. Still, they occurred, particularly among prisoners forced to work in factories supplying the German war effort. Each damaged component represented a small refusal to cooperate with the machinery of destruction. Information itself became a tool of resistance. Prisoners passed warnings to one another about selections, impending punishments, or dangerous assignments. Experienced inmates quietly taught newcomers how to survive, how to stand during roll call, how to hide weakness, how to avoid drawing attention. These lessons were shared at great personal risk. Helping another prisoner could be interpreted as insubordination or sabotage. Organized resistance networks also formed, though their existence was fragile and constantly threatened. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, underground groups emerged among political prisoners, especially those with prior experience in resistance movements. These networks smuggled information, forged documents, and attempted to establish contact with the outside world. Messages describing mass murder were passed to the Polish resistance and eventually reached Allied governments, though they were often met with disbelief or inaction. The most extraordinary and tragic acts of resistance occurred among the Sonderkommando. These prisoners were forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoria, handling the bodies of those who had been murdered. The Nazis regularly killed and replaced Sonderkommando units to eliminate witnesses. Knowing they were condemned regardless, some members planned a revolt on October 7, 1944. That revolt erupted. Sonderkommando prisoners at Crematorium 4 attacked SS guards using smuggled explosives and improvised weapons. They damaged the crematorium, set parts of it on fire, and attempted to escape. The uprising was quickly suppressed. Hundreds of prisoners were killed. The revolt did not halt the killings, but it destroyed one crematorium permanently and sent an unmistakable message. Even here, resistance was possible. The women's camp played a crucial role in this uprising. Female prisoners working in munitions factories secretly smuggled gunpowder to the Sonderkommando, passing it in tiny amounts over months. They knew the consequences if discovered. Several were later tortured and executed for their role. Their actions demonstrated extraordinary courage in a place where survival itself was already a daily struggle. Not all resistance involved violence. Some prisoners documented what they witnessed, burying notes, drawings, and testimonies in the ground near the crematoria. These records were meant for a future they might never see. They wanted the world to know what had happened here. Some of these documents were later recovered, providing invaluable evidence of the crimes committed. Religious and cultural resistance also persisted. Secret prayer groups formed. Jewish holidays were remembered quietly. Songs were sung under breath. These moments were fleeting and dangerous, but they offered a sense of continuity with a world that the Nazis were trying to destroy completely. They reminded prisoners that their lives had meaning beyond the camp. Children, though rarely able to resist in organized ways, expressed defiance through imagination and play. Survivors recalled children whispering stories, drawing pictures in dirt, or holding on to makeshift toys. These acts were fragile and often short-lived, but they represented an instinctive refusal to accept the camp's definition of reality. The cost of resistance was almost always fatal. The system was designed to crush rebellion swiftly and publicly. Punishments were collective. One person's defiance could result in many deaths. This reality forced prisoners into impossible moral calculations. Choosing survival often meant silence. Choosing resistance often meant death. Neither option was simple, and judging those choices from the outside risks misunderstanding the conditions under which they were made. What these acts of resistance ultimately reveal is not a failure of the victims to fight back, but the overwhelming power of the system they were trapped inside. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not a battlefield. It was a machine. Resistance did not fail because prisoners lacked courage. It failed because the machinery of genocide was vast, methodical, and supported by a state committed to extermination. And yet, resistance mattered. It mattered because it preserved truth. It mattered because it affirmed humanity where the Nazis sought to erase it. It mattered because it left behind evidence, memory, and testimony that could not be destroyed entirely. The uprising, the smuggled notes, the whispered prayers, all of these acts ensure that Auschwitz-Birkenau is remembered not only as a site of death, but as a place where human dignity was challenged and, in moments, fiercely defended. In the next chapter, we will turn toward the final phase of Birkenau's operation. As the war began to turn against Nazi Germany, the camp entered its last, most chaotic months. The effort to erase evidence intensified, and the fate of those still imprisoned grew even more precarious. Chapter 5, Segment 1. The final phase: retreat, erasure, and the marches of death. By the summer of 1944, the world beyond Auschwitz-Birkenau was changing. The war that had enabled the camp's existence was beginning to turn against Nazi Germany. Allied forces had landed in Normandy. Soviet troops were advancing steadily from the east. And for the first time since its creation, Auschwitz was no longer safely distant from the front lines of the conflict. Inside the camp, this shift was felt not as relief, but as intensification. The SS leadership understood that Auschwitz-Birkenau represented overwhelming evidence of crimes that could not be defended or denied if discovered intact. The camp was not merely a prison complex. It was a record, a physical archive of mass murder, built from gas chambers, crematoria, storage warehouses, transport documents, and administrative files. As defeat became increasingly likely, the priority shifted from efficiency of killing to destruction of proof. Orders were issued to dismantle the machinery of extermination. Crematoria that had once operated continuously were slowed or shut down. Gas chambers were partially destroyed. Documents were burned. Ash pits were emptied or concealed. Human remains were reburied or scattered. Prisoners were forced to exhume mass graves and burn bodies that had been buried earlier in the war, a final attempt to erase physical traces of murder. This phase was not an act of remorse, it was an act of concealment. The same prisoners who had been forced to participate in extermination were now compelled to assist in hiding it. They understood what this meant. When the evidence was gone, they would be next. The SS had no intention of leaving witnesses behind. At the same time, deportations continued. In 1944 alone, hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau in one of the most rapid extermination campaigns of the Holocaust. Entire communities were destroyed within weeks. Trains arrived daily. Selection occurred at unprecedented speed. Many victims were murdered within hours of arrival. This acceleration revealed the true nature of the camp. Even as Germany faced military collapse, the priority remained genocide. Resources were diverted. Trains were reassigned. Manpower was concentrated. The killing did not slow because the war demanded otherwise. It continued because extermination was central to Nazi ideology, not a secondary consequence of war. As Soviet forces approached Poland, panic spread among camp authorities. Evacuation plans were drawn up. The SS began transferring prisoners westward to camps deeper within German territory. These evacuations were carried out on foot, in winter conditions, with little food or shelter. They became known as the death marches. Prisoners were forced to march for days and weeks through snow and freezing temperatures. Anyone who fell behind was shot. Bodies were left along roadsides. Civilians witnessed columns of skeletal figures moving silently through villages, guarded by armed SS men. These marches were not organized evacuations. They were acts of disposal. For those still alive, survival depended on chance, strength, and the willingness of others to help. Some civilians secretly provided food or shelter, risking execution. Others turned away. Many prisoners died not from direct violence, but from exhaustion, exposure, and starvation. Inside Auschwitz itself, chaos grew. SS personnel fled or destroyed records. Discipline weakened. Supplies dwindled. Medical care disappeared entirely. The camp population became increasingly unstable, with thousands of prisoners abandoned without clear orders or oversight. Disease spread rapidly. Typhus outbreaks intensified. The smell of decay filled the air. For those left behind, the waiting became unbearable. Would the SS return to kill remaining prisoners? Would the camp be bombed? Would liberation arrive in time? No one knew. Some prisoners attempted escape during this confusion, though success was rare. Others hid in abandoned barracks or storage areas, hoping to survive long enough for liberation. Many were too weak to move. They remained where they were, lying on wooden bunks, conserving energy, listening for sounds that might signal either rescue or death. The psychological toll of this final phase was immense. Survivors later described it as a period of suspended terror. The killing had slowed, but uncertainty had intensified. The structure that had governed daily life, however brutal, was collapsing. In its place was disorder, fear, and the knowledge that the Nazis were trying to disappear both the evidence and the people. This was not the end of Auschwitz-Birkenau's violence. That it was its final transformation. The camp shifted from a place of systematic murder to a place of abandonment and neglect, where death occurred through exposure, disease, and deliberate indifference. For many, liberation would arrive only hours or days too late. In the next segment, we will follow the final moments before liberation. We will examine what Soviet soldiers found when they entered Auschwitz-Birkenau in January 1945, and how the reality of the camp confronted the world with a truth that could no longer be hidden. Chapter 5, Segment 2, Liberation, What the World Found When the Gates Opened. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet Red Army entered Auschwitz-Birkenau. They did not arrive to a battlefield. There was no dramatic clash, no final confrontation between armies. The SS had already fled days earlier, taking with them those prisoners strong enough to march. What remained was silence, snow, and a place so damaged by violence that even seasoned soldiers struggled to understand what they were seeing. Inside the camp, approximately 7,000 prisoners were still alive. Most were too sick or weak to be evacuated. Many lay motionless on wooden bunks, unable to stand. Others wandered aimlessly through the barracks, wrapped in rags, barely comprehending that the guards were gone. Liberation did not arrive as celebration. It arrived as confusion. Some prisoners were too traumatized to believe it was real. The Soviet soldiers were unprepared for what they encountered. They had liberated towns and camps before, but Auschwitz-Birkenau was different. The scale was overwhelming. Barracks stretched endlessly. Watchtowers stood empty. Barbed wire fences hummed faintly in the winter air. Warehouses contained mountains of personal belongings. Suitcases labeled with names, children's shoes, eyeglasses, hair, prosthetic limbs. Each object represented a life that had passed through this place and never returned. The gas chambers and crematoria, though partially destroyed, were still visible. Ruins stood where buildings once processed thousands of bodies per day. Ash covered the ground in places. Bone fragments were embedded in soil. The evidence was not hidden enough. The attempt to erase history had failed. For the prisoners who survived long enough to see liberation, the moment was surreal. Some cried. Some remained silent. Many did not react at all. Their bodies were alive, but their minds were still trapped in survival mode. Years of terror had stripped away the ability to feel relief. Medical teams followed the soldiers, but they were overwhelmed immediately. Typhus, dysentery, starvation, and frostbite were widespread. Many prisoners died in the days and weeks after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover even with care. Liberation had come too late for thousands. The Soviet army documented what they found. Photographs were taken. Film footage recorded the conditions. Testimonies were collected from survivors. These records became some of the earliest and most important evidence of the Holocaust. They contradicted Nazi claims. They silenced denial. They forced the world to confront what had been done. Yet even as evidence was gathered, understanding lagged behind. The sheer scale of murder was difficult to process. Numbers did not convey reality. 1 million lives lost could not be grasped by statistics alone. It would take years of testimony, research, and education for the world to begin to comprehend the full meaning of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Survivors faced a new, painful uncertainty. Many did not know if their families were alive. Most had nowhere to go. Homes had been destroyed. Communities erased. Anti-Semitism still existed beyond the camp fences. Liberation did not mean safety or belonging. It meant starting again from nothing, carrying memories that few wanted to hear. Some survivors returned to their hometowns only to find strangers living in their homes. Others encountered hostility or violence. Many chose to leave Europe entirely, seeking refuge elsewhere. The psychological wounds followed them for decades. For the liberators, Auschwitz became a defining memory. Soldiers later spoke of nightmares, guilt, and the feeling that they had arrived too late. The camp changed how they understood war. It was not just about territory or victory. It was about what human beings could do to one another when ideology erased empathy. As news of the camp spread, Allied leaders were forced to confront their own failures. Information about mass murder had reached governments earlier in the war, but action had been limited. Auschwitz raised difficult questions about indifference, disbelief, and political priorities. Liberation did not close the story of Auschwitz-Birkenau. It opened it. The camp became a crime scene. Investigations began. SS personnel were hunted. Trials were prepared. Survivors were called to testify, to relive experiences that language could barely hold. Justice would come slowly and incompletely, and memory would become a responsibility. In the next segment, we will examine what happened after liberation, not only to the camp itself, but to the historical record. We will explore how Auschwitz-Birkenau was preserved, studied, and transformed into a memorial, and why remembering this place remains essential long after the last survivors are gone. Chapter 5, Segment 3. From Crime Scene to Memorial, Remembering Auschwitz-Birkenau. After liberation, Auschwitz-Birkenau did not immediately become a place of remembrance. In the months that followed January 1945, it existed first as a site of survival, investigation, and uncertainty. Thousands of survivors remained in or near the camp, receiving medical care, waiting for news of relatives, and trying to understand what their lives might become. At the same time, the land itself bore the physical scars of genocide. Ruins, ash, abandoned belongings, and mass graves that could not be ignored. The Soviet authorities treated Auschwitz initially as evidence. Investigators documented buildings, collected artifacts, and recorded testimony from survivors and local residents. The camp was used during post-war trials as proof of Nazi crimes. Photographs taken immediately after liberation were introduced in courtrooms, confronting judges and the public with images that words alone could not convey. Auschwitz-Birkenau became central to the legal case against the architects of the Holocaust. Yet even as evidence was gathered, the future of the site was uncertain. Europe was rebuilding from devastation. Millions were displaced. Political systems were shifting. In this atmosphere, there was debate over whether camps like Auschwitz should be dismantled, reused, or preserved. Some argued that the land should be reclaimed, that the ruins were too painful to maintain. Others insisted that destruction would mean forgetting. Survivors played a crucial role in shaping the outcome. Former prisoners returned to Auschwitz-Birkenau and demanded preservation. They understood that memory was fragile. They feared that denial, distortion, or indifference would follow if physical evidence disappeared. Their voices helped ensure that the camp would remain as it was found, not restored, not beautified, but preserved in its damaged state. In 1947, the Polish government established the Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum. The decision transformed the camp into a memorial and educational site. Barracks were stabilized. Crematoria ruins were secured. Exhibits were created using original objects recovered from the camp. Shoes, suitcases, eyeglasses, and hair were displayed not as artifacts, but as evidence of individual lives lost. The memorial was never intended to be neutral. It was meant to confront visitors with the reality of genocide. The buildings were left cold and stark. Paths followed the same routes prisoners had walked. Silence became part of the experience. There were no dramatic recreations, no added narratives beyond documented history. The site itself told the story. Over time, Auschwitz-Birkenau became one of the most visited memorials in the world. Students, historians, survivors, political leaders, and ordinary visitors arrived from across the globe. Each brought different questions, emotions, and levels of understanding. Some came seeking education. Others came to mourn. Many came struggling to comprehend how such crimes were possible. For survivors, returning was often painful. Some chose never to return. Others felt compelled to bear witness in person. They guided tours, spoke to students, and shared testimonies despite the emotional cost. Their presence transformed the camp from a silent ruin into a place of living memory. As decades passed, new challenges emerged. Holocaust denial and distortion began to spread, often exploiting distance from the events and the fading presence of survivors. Auschwitz-Birkenau became a front line against misinformation. Scholars intensified research. Educators developed programs to contextualize the camp within broader Nazi ideology and European history. International recognition followed. In 1979, Auschwitz-Birkenau was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The designation acknowledged not only the historical significance of the camp, but its universal importance as a warning. It recognized Auschwitz not as a Polish tragedy alone, nor a Jewish tragedy alone, but as a crime against humanity. Preservation itself became an ethical challenge. Time, weather, and decay threatened buildings never meant to last this long. Conservators faced difficult decisions. How to stabilize structures without altering them. How to protect artifacts without removing their meaning. How to allow millions to visit without erasing the site through wear. Every intervention required careful consideration. The memorial's mission expanded beyond history. Auschwitz-Birkenau became a place to examine moral responsibility, obedience, dehumanization, and the consequences of hatred. Educational programs addressed racism, anti-Semitism, and genocide prevention. The camp's lessons were connected to contemporary human rights issues, not as comparisons, but as warnings. Yet no amount of education can fully resolve the weight of the site. Visitors often leave with more questions than answers. How could neighbors participate? How could bureaucracy enable murder? How could so many look away? Auschwitz does not offer closure. It offers confrontation that, as the survivor generation diminishes, responsibility shifts. Memory now depends on documentation, education, and institutions. Auschwitz-Birkenau stands as a physical reminder when living witnesses are no longer present. Its continued existence challenges each generation to decide whether remembrance will be active or passive. The camp does not speak on its OWN that IT requires engagement. Honesty, willingness to learn and to acknowledge uncomfortable truths. Forgetting is easy. Remembering demands effort that Auschwitz-Birkenau endures not because it represents the worst of humanity alone, but because it tests whether humanity can learn from its worst acts. The preservation of this place is not about the past alone. It is about the future that in the final chapter, we will reflect on the legacy of Auschwitz-Birkenau, what it has taught the world, what remains unresolved, and why remembrance remains a moral obligation long after the last witness has gone. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The Legacy of Auschwitz-Birkenau and the Meaning of Memory. Auschwitz-Birkenau did not end when the gates were opened. Its physical liberation marked only the beginning of a much longer, more complex legacy, one that continues to shape historical understanding, moral philosophy, international law, and collective memory decades later. The camp ceased functioning as a place of imprisonment, but it became something else entirely, a symbol of industrialized genocide and a permanent measure of how far human systems can descend when ideology replaces conscience. In the years following the war, Auschwitz-Birkenau stood at the center of a global reckoning. The Nuremberg trials used evidence from the camp to demonstrate that genocide was not accidental, chaotic, or driven solely by individual cruelty. It was organized, documented, and administered through legal structures. Auschwitz became proof that crimes against humanity could be committed not only by fanatics, but by clerks, engineers, doctors, and administrators who followed procedure. This understanding reshaped international law. The concept of genocide was formally defined. Crimes against humanity became prosecutable under international standards. The principle that following orders does not absolve responsibility gained legal force. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not just evidence of Nazi crimes. It was a catalyst for new frameworks intended to prevent their repetition. Yet law alone could not contain the camp's meaning. For survivors, Auschwitz remained personal. Many carried memories that could not be translated into legal language or historical summaries. Nightmares, guilt, grief, and silence shaped lives long after liberation. Survivors spoke of the burden of having lived when so many did not, and the weight of being asked to represent experiences that defied explanation. Some survivors chose to speak publicly. Others remained silent for decades. Both responses were forms of survival. As time passed, memory itself became contested. Different nations remembered Auschwitz differently. In some places, emphasis was placed on national suffering. In others, the specifically Jewish nature of the genocide was minimized or obscured. Political narratives shaped commemoration. The camp's history was sometimes simplified, sometimes distorted, sometimes instrumentalized. These tensions revealed an uncomfortable truth. Memory is not automatic. That IT must be protected. Auschwitz-Birkenau forced societies to confront questions they often prefer to avoid. How does prejudice become policy? How does obedience replace morality? How do ordinary people become participants in extraordinary crimes? These questions had no easy answers, and they challenged assumptions about progress, civilization, and human nature. Education became central to preserving meaning. Holocaust education expanded globally, using Auschwitz as a primary case study. Students were taught not only what happened, but how it happened. The focus shifted from horror alone to process, propaganda, dehumanization, bureaucratic language, incremental normalization of violence. Auschwitz was no longer presented as an isolated aberration, but as the outcome of identifiable choices and systems. This approach was not without resistance. Some questioned the relevance of events so distant in time. Others rejected the discomfort that came with confronting complicity and indifference. Holocaust denial and minimization found space in this resistance, exploiting ignorance and fatigue. Auschwitz-Birkenau thus became a battleground over truth itself. Technology introduced new challenges and opportunities. Digital archives preserved testimonies. Virtual reconstructions allowed remote learning. Artificial intelligence began assisting in document analysis. These tools expanded access, but they also raised questions about authenticity, context, and emotional distance. How does one preserve solemnity in a digital age? How does memory survive without becoming abstract? The absence of survivors intensified these concerns. As the generation that experienced Auschwitz firsthand dwindled, the responsibility of remembrance shifted entirely to those who did not live through it. Memory moved from lived experience to inherited obligation. This transition made sites like Auschwitz-Birkenau even more significant. They became anchors of reality in a world increasingly removed from the events themselves. Auschwitz also influenced how later atrocities were understood. Genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and elsewhere were often analyzed through frameworks developed in response to the Holocaust. While each tragedy was distinct, Auschwitz provided language and warning. It demonstrated that genocide does not begin with violence. It begins with classification, exclusion, and silence. Yet remembrance alone does not guarantee prevention. Despite Auschwitz, mass violence has continued in the modern world. This reality forces an uncomfortable reckoning. Memory can inform, but it cannot compel. The lessons of Auschwitz require active engagement, not reverence alone. They demand vigilance against dehumanization in all its forms. That Auschwitz-Birkenau stands as a contradiction. IT is a place where humanity failed catastrophically, yet remains a place where humanity insists on remembering that failure. It is both evidence of destruction and a testament to responsibility. It does not offer redemption. It offers warning. That in the next segment, we will explore how remembrance continues in the present day, how Auschwitz-Birkenau is taught, visited, debated, and protected in a world facing new forms of extremism, denial, and historical distance. Chapter 6, Segment 2, Teaching the Camp to a World That Did Not See It. As the decades passed and the voices of survivors began to fade, Auschwitz-Birkenau entered a new and difficult phase of its existence. The camp was no longer explained primarily by those who had lived through it. Instead, it had to be taught, interpreted, and carried forward by historians, educators, archivists, and institutions tasked with translating an incomprehensible reality to generations who had no living connection to it. This transition was not smooth. Teaching Auschwitz-Birkenau required more than recounting facts. Numbers alone could not communicate meaning. Dates and statistics risked turning mass murder into abstraction. Educators faced a central challenge: How to convey the reality of genocide without overwhelming, desensitizing, or distorting it. Point one approach focused on individual stories. Instead of beginning with millions, educators began with names. Diaries, letters, photographs, a single suitcase with a handwritten address, a child's shoe, a family portrait taken before deportation. These fragments grounded history in human experience. They reminded learners that genocide is not the loss of numbers, but the destruction of lives, relationships, and futures. Another approach emphasized process that Auschwitz-Birkenau was taught not as an inexplicable eruption of evil, but as the outcome of deliberate steps. Legal discrimination, propaganda, gradual normalization of violence, administrative efficiency. Each stage showed how genocide becomes possible long before killing begins. This framework challenged the comforting belief that such crimes are unimaginable or alien. The camp itself became a classroom. Guided visits through Auschwitz and Birkenau were designed to be restrained and factual. There were no dramatizations, no reenactments. Silence was encouraged. Guides avoided graphic detail unless necessary, focusing instead on structure, function, and context. The goal was not shock, but understanding. Yet even this approach carried risks. Mass tourism raised ethical questions. How does one balance access with respect? How does one prevent the site from becoming a destination stripped of meaning? Incidents of inappropriate behavior by visitors, posing for photos, casual language, distraction, sparked debates about responsibility in education. The memorial responded by strengthening guidelines and educational framing. Visitors were reminded that Auschwitz-Birkenau is not a museum in the conventional sense. It is a cemetery without gravestones. Behavior expectations were made explicit. Educational materials emphasize reflection rather than consumption of information. At the same time, new generations brought new perspectives. Students raised questions about complicity, obedience, and bystander behavior. They asked how ordinary people became participants. They examined parallels not to equate histories, but to understand mechanisms. These questions expanded the meaning of Auschwitz beyond the Holocaust itself, turning it into a lens for examining power, prejudice, and moral choice. This expansion was not universally welcomed. Some feared that broadening the lessons of Auschwitz risked diluting its specificity. Others worried that connecting the camp to contemporary issues could politicize memory. These debates reflected a deeper tension. Remembrance must remain truthful, but it must also remain relevant. Denial and distortion intensified these challenges. Holocaust denial, minimization, and conspiracy theories spread through the internet and social media. Auschwitz-Birkenau became a focal point in this struggle over truth. False claims targeted survivor testimony, questioned evidence, or reframed genocide as exaggeration. Each distortion demanded response. Institutions answered with documentation. Archives were digitized. Testimonies were preserved in multiple formats. Scholarly research expanded access to original records. The physical evidence of Auschwitz, the ruins, the artifacts, the documents, serve as anchors against misinformation. Yet even evidence has limits. For many, Auschwitz is distant in time and geography. Emotional connection weakens as immediacy fades. Educators confronted a paradox. The more thoroughly the Holocaust is documented, the easier it can become to consume without reflection. That address this. Some programs emphasized ethical engagement. Instead of asking only what happened, learners were asked what responsibility memory carries. What does it mean to know this history? How should it influence attitudes toward dehumanization, authority, and silence? These questions reframed Auschwitz not as a completed story, but as an ongoing moral challenge. Survivor testimonies remained central for as long as possible. Recorded interviews preserved voices that could no longer speak in person. These testimonies did not seek to explain everything. Often, they expressed confusion, pain, and unanswered questions. Their power lay in honesty rather than clarity. As the survivor generation diminished, a new responsibility emerged. The task of remembrance passed entirely to those who did not experience the Holocaust. This transfer was fragile. Without lived memory, history depends on integrity, care, and sustained effort. Forgetting becomes easier. Distortion becomes more tempting. That Auschwitz-Birkenau, thus, stands not only as a historical site, but as a test that it tests whether societies will remember difficult truths without witnesses, whether education will resist simplification, whether remembrance will remain an act of responsibility rather than ritual. In the next and final segment, we will consider what Auschwitz-Birkenau means today and into the future. We will reflect on why remembrance remains necessary, what is at stake if it fades, and how the legacy of this place continues to shape moral understanding long after the last survivor is gone. Chapter 6, Segment 3. Why Auschwitz-Birkenau Still Matters. Auschwitz-Birkenau exists today in a world very different from the one that created it. The uniforms, flags, and leaders responsible for its crimes are gone. The ideology that built it was defeated militarily. And yet, the questions raised by this place remain unresolved. The camp endures not because history demands remembrance automatically, but because forgetting would carry consequences. Auschwitz matters because it demonstrates how genocide is not an accident of chaos, but the result of systems working as intended. Every stage of the camp's operation relied on organization, efficiency, and obedience. Trains ran on time. Records were kept. Supplies were ordered. Paperwork flowed. Violence was normalized through routine. The lesson is unsettling. The same structures that enable stability can enable destruction when guided by dehumanizing ideology. This challenges comforting assumptions. Many people want to believe that atrocities are committed only by monsters, by individuals who are visibly cruel or obviously evil. Auschwitz-Birkenau undermines that belief. It shows how ordinary people, clerks, engineers, doctors, guards, can become participants when responsibility is fragmented and morality is replaced by procedure. This does not mean that everyone involved was equally guilty, but it does mean that genocide does not require universal fanaticism, that it requires enough compliance. Auschwitz also matters because it reveals the danger of gradualism. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with language, with laws that classified people, with restrictions that seemed temporary, with propaganda that framed exclusion as necessity. Each step made the next easier. By the time extermination camps were operating, resistance had already been weakened. This progression is one of Auschwitz's most urgent warnings. Mass violence rarely announces itself at the start. It advances incrementally. By the time its final form is visible, it is often already entrenched. Auschwitz reminds us that prevention depends on early attention, not retrospective condemnation. The camp also confronts the limits of justice. Many perpetrators were never prosecuted. Some reintegrated into post-war society. Others lived quietly, their crimes known only to a few. Legal systems struggled to address crimes of such magnitude. Trials were selective. Sentences varied. Closure was incomplete. This reality forces an uncomfortable truth. Justice, while necessary, is often insufficient. That Auschwitz-Birkenau therefore places emphasis on responsibility beyond punishment. Responsibility to remember. Responsibility to educate. Responsibility to resist denial and distortion. Responsibility to recognize early signs of dehumanization. Memory, however, is not passive. Simply knowing that Auschwitz existed does not prevent repetition. Memory can become ritualized, emptied of urgency. Annual commemorations can lose meaning if detached from reflection. Auschwitz challenges each generation to decide whether remembrance will be active or symbolic. This challenge becomes more pressing as time passes. Without survivors, memory relies entirely on institutions, educators, and individuals. Historical distance invites simplification. Complexity is flattened. Moral discomfort. Auschwitz risks becoming a reference rather than a reckoning. That is why sites like Birkenau remain essential. Walking the grounds reveals scale that books cannot convey. The distance between barracks, the length of the selection ramp, the isolation of the crematoria ruins. These physical realities resist abstraction. They ground history in place. Yet even physical presence is not enough. That Auschwitz-Birkenau does not instruct visitors what to think. It does not offer lessons neatly packaged. It demands interpretation, humility, and engagement. It confronts visitors with evidence and leaves them to wrestle with meaning. This openness is both its strength and its vulnerability. Without context, silence can be misunderstood. Without education, complexity can be lost. That is why remembrance requires effort beyond visitation. It requires sustained learning, critical thinking, and moral courage. Auschwitz also speaks to contemporary concerns without making direct comparisons. That IT does not equate modern conflicts with the Holocaust. Instead, it offers tools for analysis. It sharpens awareness of how language, fear, and power interact. It asks how societies respond to exclusion. It asks how institutions justify harm. It asks when silence becomes complicity. These questions remain relevant because human behavior has not fundamentally changed. Technology evolves. Political systems shift, but the capacity for dehumanization persists. Auschwitz-Birkenau stands as evidence of where that capacity can lead when unchecked. Remembering Auschwitz is not about guilt inherited by those who came later. It is about responsibility inherited. Responsibility to recognize warning signs. Responsibility to protect truth. Responsibility to defend human dignity. The camp does not ask to be mourned endlessly. It asks to be understood honestly. We conclude this documentary. The purpose is not to leave you with despair. It is to leave you with awareness. Auschwitz-Birkenau demonstrates the consequences of indifference as clearly as it demonstrates the consequences of hatred. The existence of this place demands vigilance, not fear. Memory, when engaged thoughtfully, becomes a safeguard. Forgetting, when allowed to take hold, becomes an opening. Auschwitz-Birkenau remains because the world decided it must. What it continues to mean depends on whether that decision is renewed, and that responsibility now belongs entirely to the living. Chapter 7, Segment 1. Global Memory and the Responsibility Beyond Auschwitz. Auschwitz-Birkenau is a specific place, rooted in a specific history, yet its meaning extends far beyond its fences. As the decades have passed, the camp has become a reference point for how the world understands mass violence, state power, and the consequences of dehumanization. Its legacy is no longer confined to Europe or to the history of the Second World War. It has become part of a global moral vocabulary. This transformation did not happen automatically. In the years immediately following the war, much of the world struggled to absorb what Auschwitz represented. The scale of the crimes defied comprehension. Many survivors encountered disbelief when they tried to speak. Some governments preferred narratives of heroism and victory over narratives of victimization and complicity. Silence, both intentional and unintentional, shaped the early post-war decades. Gradually, this began to change. International trials, survivor memoirs, historical research, and public education slowly brought Auschwitz-Birkenau into global consciousness. The camp became a symbol not only of Jewish suffering, but of the dangers inherent in unchecked state power and ideological extremism. Its lessons were increasingly applied to discussions of human rights, genocide prevention, and international responsibility. This expansion carried both promise and risk that, on one hand, Auschwitz offered a framework for recognizing early warning signs of mass violence. Scholars and policymakers drew on Holocaust history to understand later atrocities, emphasizing patterns such as propaganda, scapegoating, and bureaucratic normalization of harm. The phrase "never again" emerged as a commitment to vigilance that, on the other hand, symbolism risked oversimplification. When Auschwitz is invoked too easily or too frequently, its specificity can be lost. The camp was not a metaphor. It was a physical system of extermination shaped by particular historical conditions. Using it carelessly risks turning history into analogy rather than understanding. Preserving accuracy while acknowledging relevance became a delicate balance. Global remembrance also exposed uneven engagement that in some regions, Holocaust education became deeply embedded in school curricula and public discourse. In others, it remained distant or peripheral. Political priorities, cultural narratives, and historical distance shaped how Auschwitz was remembered, or whether it was remembered at all. This unevenness raised difficult questions to is remembrance a universal obligation or a regional one? Who is responsible for carrying this history forward? Can memory imposed from the outside ever be meaningful, or must it emerge organically within societies? Auschwitz-Birkenau challenges the idea that memory belongs only to those directly affected. While the victims were targeted as Jews and other persecuted groups, the mechanisms that enabled their destruction were human and institutional. The lessons of Auschwitz speak to any society that relies on bureaucracy, authority, and collective identity. This universality does not erase specificity. It reinforces relevance. The camp's legacy also influenced international norms. Concepts such as crimes against humanity, genocide, and universal jurisdiction gained traction partly because Auschwitz demonstrated what happens when sovereign states are allowed to commit mass murder without consequence. International bodies, though imperfect, were shaped by the recognition that some crimes transcend borders. Yet Auschwitz also reveals the limits of international response. Despite the promise of never again, mass atrocities continued after the Holocaust. Rwanda, Bosnia, Cambodia, Darfur, each raised the same questions. Why was the warning ignored? Why was intervention delayed? Why did the world respond only after violence escalated? These failures do not diminish Auschwitz's importance. They underscore it. The camp stands as a reminder that knowledge alone is not enough. Moral frameworks require action. Legal definitions require enforcement. Memory requires responsibility. In contemporary society, new challenges complicate remembrance. Information spreads faster, but attention spans shorten. Historical nuance competes with misinformation. Extremist ideologies adapt to digital spaces. Holocaust denial mutates into relativization or mockery. Auschwitz-Birkenau remains relevant not because the past repeats itself exactly, but because the conditions that allow dehumanization evolve rather than disappear. Education, therefore, becomes an ongoing task. Not education as repetition, but education as engagement. Teaching Auschwitz requires honesty about complexity and discomfort. It requires acknowledging not only perpetrators and victims, but bystanders and institutions. It requires confronting how ordinary systems, transport, medicine, law, were repurposed for destruction. This approach resists the comfort of distance that IT reminds learners that the people who built and operated Auschwitz were not mythical villains. They were products of a society that normalized exclusion and rewarded obedience. This recognition is unsettling, but it is essential. It prevents memory from becoming self-congratulatory. Auschwitz-Birkenau also invites reflection on empathy. The camp exposes the consequences of defining some lives as less worthy than others. It challenges societies to examine how language, policy, and in different shape who is protected and who is excluded. These questions are not historical artifacts. They are present concerns as global memory continues to evolve. Auschwitz-Birkenau remains a reference point not because it offers easy answers, but because it demands difficult ones. It asks whether humanity is willing to learn from its own capacity for harm. It asks whether remembrance will translate into vigilance. It asks whether history will be used to excuse inevitability or to affirm responsibility. I end the final segment. We will bring this documentary to a close by reflecting on remembrance itself, what it means to remember well, what is lost when memory fades, and why Auschwitz-Birkenau must remain not only preserved, but understood long into the future. Chapter 7, Segment 2, The Fragility of Memory and the Danger of Distance. As Auschwitz-Birkenau moves further into the past, a new and quieter danger emerges. It is not denial in its most obvious form, nor open praise of the ideology that created the camp. It is distance, temporal, emotional, and cultural distance that slowly erodes urgency and replaces lived reality with abstraction. For the first decades after the war, memory was anchored by presence. Survivors spoke in classrooms, testified in courtrooms, appeared in documentaries. Their voices carried authority not because they were polished or complete, but because they were immediate. They did not offer tidy explanations. They offered fragments, silences, emotion that could not be rehearsed. That presence is now fading as the survivor generation diminishes. Auschwitz-Birkenau risks becoming history without witnesses. This does not mean it becomes unimportant. It means that its survival as meaningful memory now depends entirely on those who did not experience it. That shift changes everything. Without witnesses, memory becomes vulnerable. IT can be simplified, reduced to slogans, confined to anniversaries, or reshaped to fit contemporary agendas. The complexity of Auschwitz, the contradictions, the moral ambiguity, the institutional failures, can be flattened into a single narrative that feels distant and resolved. This creates space for distortion. Some distortions are overt. Holocaust denial continues to circulate, often disguised as skepticism or alternative research. These narratives challenge evidence, dismiss testimony, and reframe genocide as exaggeration. They persist not because of lack of proof, but because repetition exploits distance and fatigue. Other distortions are more subtle. They minimize responsibility by framing Auschwitz as the work of a few extremists rather than a system supported by bureaucracy and compliance. They universalize suffering in ways that erase specificity, turning the Holocaust into a vague tragedy detached from anti-Semitism and Nazi ideology. They emphasize closure rather than consequence. Even well-intentioned remembrance can drift into ritual. Annual ceremonies risk becoming routine. Visits risk becoming symbolic rather than reflective. Familiar phrases lose weight when repeated without engagement. Memory becomes performance instead of responsibility. This is not inevitable. but it requires effort to resist. One of the most significant challenges is generational disconnect. Younger generations encounter Auschwitz through textbooks, museums, and digital media. These formats are necessary, but they lack immediacy. Without guidance, the camp can feel unreal, too extreme to connect to ordinary life. This disconnect can foster complacency. If Auschwitz is seen as an anomaly rather than an outcome, its lessons feel irrelevant. If it is framed as an incomprehensible evil rather than a human-made system, responsibility dissolves. Distance becomes comfort. Education attempts to bridge this gap, but it must navigate tension. Too much detail risks overwhelming. Too little risks trivializing. Emotional engagement must be balanced with historical accuracy. Educators must avoid sensationalism while still conveying gravity. This balance is difficult, but essential. Technology complicates memory further. Digital platforms allow unprecedented access to documents, images, and testimony. They also encourage rapid consumption. Context can be lost. Algorithms do not prioritize reflection. The same tools that preserve memory can also dilute IT the same time. Digital spaces enable denial to spread quickly. False claims gain traction through repetition. Irony and humor are used to mask distortion. Extremist narratives adapt language to evade scrutiny. Auschwitz-Birkenau becomes a target not only because of what it represents, but because undermining its history weakens the moral foundations built in response to it. This places new responsibility on institutions. Museums, archives, and educators must not only preserve evidence, but actively interpret it. They must respond to misinformation without amplifying it. They must defend complexity in environments that reward simplicity. That IT also places responsibility on individuals. Remembering Auschwitz is not a passive act. It requires attention, willingness to confront discomfort, refusal to accept easy explanations. It requires recognizing that the conditions that enabled Auschwitz were not unique to one time or place. Distance can also create selective memory. Some societies emphasize heroism over victimhood. Others focus on national suffering while ignoring complicity. These narratives shape how Auschwitz is integrated into collective identity. What is remembered often reflects what is easier to accept. That Auschwitz-Birkenau challenges selective memory directly. That IT resists being absorbed into a single national story. It exposes transnational responsibility. German perpetrators occupied territories, collaborating governments, indifferent bystanders. All are part of the history. This complexity is uncomfortable, and discomfort often invites avoidance. The danger of distance is not forgetting entirely. That IT is remembering incorrectly, remembering without responsibility, remembering without context, remembering without relevance. Auschwitz does not demand constant mourning. That IT demands honest engagement. That as time passes, the camp's survival as a meaningful warning depends less on how often it is mentioned and more on how deeply it is understood. Distance can be bridged, but only if it is acknowledged. That in the final segment, we will reflect on what it means to remember Auschwitz-Birkenau well, not as an obligation imposed by history, but as a conscious choice made by each generation to confront the past in order to protect the future. Chapter 7, Segment 3. Responsibility after the witnesses are gone. When the last survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau is gone, nothing about the camp will physically disappear. The barracks will remain. The ruins of the crematoria will still sit in silence. The documents will still exist in archives. Photographs will still be studied. Names will still be read aloud. And yet, something essential will be missing. The living connection between past and present will no longer be carried by those who endured it firsthand. Memory will become entirely inherited. This transition marks one of the most critical moments in the history of Holocaust remembrance. Without witnesses, responsibility shifts completely. IT no longer rests on testimony alone. It rests on interpretation, preservation, and moral choice. Future generations will not be able to ask survivors what it felt like to stand on the selection ramp, or how it sounded when trains arrived at night. They will have to rely on what has been recorded, what has been taught, and what has been protected from distortion. This makes remembrance an active duty rather than a passive inheritance. That Auschwitz-Birkenau was never meant to be understood only as a historical site. It was and remains a warning. But warnings lose their power when their origin feels remote. When horror becomes familiar, it risks becoming tolerable. When atrocity becomes historical, it risks becoming theoretical. That is why responsibility after the witnesses are gone must be deliberate. Institutions alone cannot carry this burden. Memorials can preserve space, but they cannot preserve meaning on their own. Education systems can provide information, but information without moral context can feel inert. Archives can store evidence, but evidence requires engagement to remain alive. The responsibility belongs to society as a whole. That IT belongs to educators who refuse to simplify the Holocaust into a single narrative of evil detached from human decision-making. It belongs to historians who insist on nuance without relativizing responsibility. It belongs to journalists who challenge denial and distortion without sensationalism. That IT also belongs to ordinary individuals. That remember Auschwitz-Birkenau well is to resist comfort. It means acknowledging that the camp was not the product of madness alone, but of bureaucracy, obedience, and indifference. It means understanding that genocide was not only enforced by perpetrators, but enabled by silence. This recognition is unsettling, and it should be. Auschwitz disrupts the idea that atrocities are committed only by monsters. It reveals how systems can normalize cruelty, how language can mask violence, and how incremental decisions can lead to irreversible outcomes. These lessons remain relevant precisely because they're uncomfortable. Memory that reassures is dangerous. True remembrance does not offer closure. It does not provide a sense that the past has been resolved. Instead, it demands vigilance. It asks what conditions allowed Auschwitz to exist, and whether those conditions can emerge again under different names. The camp also challenges the limits of empathy. As time passes, there is a temptation to universalize suffering in ways that blur specificity. While empathy is essential, erasing the particular targeting of Jews and other persecuted groups risks misunderstanding the Holocaust itself. Remembering Auschwitz requires holding both the universal lessons and the specific crimes together. This balance is fragile. Too much distance invites abstraction. Too much abstraction invites distortion. Too much distortion invites repetition. Responsibility after the witnesses are gone also means protecting truth from erosion. Holocaust denial does not always announce itself openly. It can appear as doubt, as false equivalence, or as claims of exaggeration. It thrives in environments where historical literacy is weak and attention is fragmented. Countering it requires patience, clarity, and refusal to treat falsehood as debate. That Auschwitz-Birkenau cannot defend itself. That IT relies on human conscience. There is also responsibility in how the site is experienced. Visitors who walk through Birkenau today bring their own contexts, assumptions, and emotional frameworks. Some come seeking understanding. Others come seeking symbolism. The challenge is ensuring that the site remains a place of learning rather than consumption. Photography, social media, and tourism complicate this further. The line between documentation and trivialization is thin. When images become content rather than testimony, meaning can slip. Responsibility means asking not only what is allowed, but what is appropriate. Ultimately, the responsibility of remembrance is not about guilt. It is about awareness that it is about recognizing that Auschwitz-Birkenau was possible because human systems failed and that those failures are not confined to one era. It is about understanding that genocide begins long before violence, through language, exclusion, and normalization of dehumanization. When the witnesses are gone, memory becomes a choice to engage rather than ignore, a choice to question rather than simplify, a choice to remember accurately rather than comfortably. That Auschwitz-Birkenau does not ask to be remembered as a monument to death alone. It asks to be remembered as evidence of what happens when human dignity is systematically stripped away and when society allows that process to proceed unchecked. That in the final chapter, we will step back and consider Auschwitz-Birkenau not only as a historical site, but as a moral boundary, one that defines the consequences of forgetting and the responsibility that comes with remembering. Chapter 8, Segment 2. After Liberation, Evidence, Testimony, and the Weight of Proof. In the weeks following the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the camp became something it had never been before. It was no longer a sealed world designed for disappearance. It became a place of exposure. Investigators, medical personnel, journalists, and military officials moved through its grounds, attempting to document what had happened there before time, weather, and denial could erase the traces. The first task was survival. Thousands of former prisoners were transported to nearby hospitals and improvised recovery centers. Many were too weak to speak. Others could not stop talking, driven by an urgency to explain what they had endured before the chance was taken from them. Doctors recorded extreme malnutrition, muscle atrophy, untreated injuries, and psychological shock on a scale rarely seen in medical history. At the same time, Soviet investigators began a systematic examination of the camp. They measured barracks. They mapped rail lines. They photographed crematoria ruins. They cataloged warehouses filled with confiscated belongings. Mountains of shoes, tons of human hair. Suitcases marked with names, addresses, and dates. Each object represented a person who had entered the camp believing, even briefly, that these items might be returned. The evidence was overwhelming, but required interpretation. Early reports described mass murder, but understanding how the killing was organized took time. Survivors explained selections on the ramp, gas chambers disguised as showers, and crematoria operating day and night. Their testimonies were initially met with disbelief by some officials, not because the witnesses were doubted, but because the described system defied known precedents. Killing on this scale had never been industrialized before. Investigators compared testimony with physical findings. Blueprints recovered from German offices confirmed the design of gas chambers. Chemical analysis later identified residues consistent with Zyklon B use. Architectural features, such as ventilation systems and reinforced ceilings, aligned with survivor descriptions of mass gassing. The pieces began to align that Auschwitz-Birkenau was not a chaotic site of wartime brutality. It was a planned, engineered system designed to kill efficiently. As evidence accumulated, the focus expanded beyond the camp itself. Who ordered its construction? Who authorized its expansion? Who staffed its operations? Commanders, doctors, guards, engineers, railway officials, and industrial contractors all became part of the investigative scope. Auschwitz-Birkenau revealed that genocide was not carried out by a single figure or unit, but by a network of institutions working in coordination. This realization would profoundly shape post-war justice. The concept of individual guilt had to be re-examined in the face of collective participation. Could following orders excuse participation in mass murder? Could bureaucratic distance absolve responsibility? These questions moved from the ruins of Birkenau into courtrooms to the Nuremberg trials. Auschwitz became central evidence in defining crimes against humanity and genocide. Photographs, documents, and survivor testimony were presented to demonstrate that the Holocaust was not an accident of war, but a deliberate policy. For the first time, international law attempted to name and prosecute crimes committed against entire populations. Survivors were asked to relive experiences they had spent years trying to suppress. Many testified not because they wanted to, but because they felt obligated. Silence, they believed, would allow the crime to continue in another form. Yet even as trials progressed, justice remained incomplete. Many perpetrators escaped accountability. Some fled. Others reintegrated into post-war society. Lower-ranking participants often claimed ignorance or necessity. The sheer number of those involved made comprehensive prosecution impossible. This uneven reckoning contributed to a lingering sense of injustice among survivors and their descendants. At the same time, Auschwitz-Birkenau began to assume a new role. The camp was preserved as evidence. Barracks were stabilized. Crematoria ruins were left visible. Exhibits were created using recovered artifacts. What had once been designed to erase lives now became a site dedicated to remembrance. Memory, however, was not fixed. In the immediate post-war years, the Holocaust was often framed within broader narratives of wartime suffering. Jewish victims were sometimes subsumed into general categories of civilian casualties. It would take decades for the specificity of the genocide to be fully acknowledged in public discourse. Survivors carried their memories largely alone. Many struggled with survivors' guilt. Others faced disbelief or discomfort when they spoke. Trauma manifested in silence, nightmares, and fractured families. The world that had allowed Auschwitz to exist now struggled to listen to those who had lived through it. Despite this, documentation continued. Historians, archivists, and educators collected testimonies. Former prisoners recorded their experiences in memoirs and interviews. Each account added detail and depth, countering attempts to minimize or distort the past. Auschwitz-Birkenau became not only a symbol, but a reference point. Whenever denial emerged, evidence from the camp answered it. Whenever genocide occurred elsewhere, comparisons were drawn. Whenever questions arose about how ordinary people could participate in extraordinary crimes, Birkenau provided a case study. The camp forced humanity to confront uncomfortable truths about obedience, ideology, and indifference. After liberation, Auschwitz-Birkenau no longer functioned as a killing center. But its role in history was only beginning. That it would become a warning, that a classroom, that a memorial, and a measure by which future actions would be judged. In the next segment, we will examine how Auschwitz-Birkenau's legacy evolved over time, how memory, denial, education, and commemoration shaped its meaning across generations, and why its lessons remain urgently relevant today. Chapter 8, Segment 1. Liberation and the Shock of Reality. In January of 1945, the Red Army moved westward through occupied Poland, pushing back collapsing German defenses as the Third Reich began to fracture under its own weight. Soviet troops had already encountered abandoned camps and evidence of mass killings before. They had seen starvation, forced labor, and mass graves. Nothing, however, prepared them for what waited behind the barbed wire of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The camp was not liberated in a dramatic moment of rescue. There were no celebrations, no sudden reversals of suffering. What the soldiers found was silence broken only by wind, ash, and the faint movement of those too weak to stand. The SS had fled days earlier, destroying what evidence they could, forcing tens of thousands of prisoners on death marches westward, and leaving behind only those deemed unfit to walk. Approximately 7,000 prisoners remained. They were emaciated beyond recognition. Many were children. Many were dying. Some had been alone for weeks, surviving on scraps, snow, and whatever strength remained in their bodies. Disease was rampant. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread easily in overcrowded barracks with no sanitation and no medical care. For the soldiers who entered the camp, the first challenge was understanding what they were seeing. The physical layout of Birkenau was vast and methodical. Rows of barracks stretched into the distance. Watchtowers stood silent. Rail lines cut through the camp, ending near ruins that were still warm with recent destruction. Piles of shoes, suitcases, and personal belongings lay scattered, abandoned in haste or left deliberately behind. Nothing about the site resembled a conventional prison camp. The scale alone suggested something far more systematic. As Soviet medical teams followed the troops, they began emergency efforts to stabilize survivors. Food had to be given carefully. Many prisoners could not digest normal rations after months or years of starvation. Some died even after liberation, their bodies unable to recover from prolonged deprivation. The liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau marked the end of the camp as an operational killing center, but did not immediately bring clarity to the outside world. It first. Even the liberators struggled to describe what they had found. The concept of an industrialized extermination camp was difficult to communicate. Reports spoke of mass murder, but the mechanisms were unfamiliar. Gas chambers were initially misunderstood or downplayed, not out of denial, but because their function was unprecedented. It took time for investigators to piece together how the camp had operated. Survivors who could speak were questioned. Documents were collected. Physical evidence was examined. The ruins of Crematoria 2 and 3, destroyed by the SS only days before liberation, still revealed traces of their purpose. Zyklon B residue was later detected. Testimonies aligned with physical findings. Gradually, a clearer picture emerged that Auschwitz-Birkenau had not been a byproduct of war. It had been a central instrument of genocide. The shock extended beyond military circles. When photographs and film footage reached the wider world, they confronted audiences with images that challenged existing frameworks of cruelty. Skeleton-like survivors, mass graves, and warehouses of stolen belongings forced a reckoning that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or propaganda. Still, understanding lagged behind exposure. For many, the scale of the crime was simply too large to process. Numbers in the hundreds of thousands were already difficult to grasp. Numbers exceeding 1 million felt abstract. The reality of families erased upon arrival, of lives reduced to ash within hours, demanded a moral recalibration that society was slow to undertake. Liberation also raised immediate legal and ethical questions. Who was responsible? How many perpetrators remain at large? How could such a system have functioned for years without intervention? These questions would shape post-war justice efforts, including the Nuremberg trials and later prosecutions. Auschwitz-Birkenau became central evidence in defining crimes against humanity and genocide as legal concepts. For survivors, liberation was not an ending. It was a transition into uncertainty. Many had no homes to return to. Entire families had been murdered. Communities no longer existed. In some cases, returning survivors faced hostility or disbelief. The physical freedom gained in January 1945 did not immediately translate into safety or belonging. Trauma did not dissolve with the opening of the gates. The camp itself became a site of investigation almost immediately. Soviet authorities documented the grounds extensively, preserving evidence while memories were still fresh. This early documentation would later play a crucial role in countering denial and distortion. Yet even with evidence, the meaning of Auschwitz-Birkenau was still forming. Liberation revealed the crime, but it did not yet define its place in human history. That process would unfold over decades, shaped by testimony, scholarship, memorialization, and moral reflection. That Auschwitz-Birkenau entered global consciousness not as a single event, but as an evolving understanding. What was clear, even in those first days, was that the camp represented a rupture. It forced humanity to confront the consequences of ideology fused with bureaucracy and violence carried out with administrative precision. The liberation did not restore what was lost. That it did not undo the crime, but it ensured that the evidence remained. In the next segment, we will explore how the immediate aftermath of liberation gave way to trials, memory formation, and a long struggle to define accountability for a crime that seemed to exceed the limits of language and law. Chapter 8, Segment 3: Memory, Denial, and the Responsibility of Remembrance. As the decades passed after the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the camp entered a new and difficult phase of its existence. No longer a site of active investigation alone, it became a place where memory itself was contested. The physical remains stood silent, but the meaning of what had happened there was anything but settled. In the years immediately following the war, survivors returned to their lives scattered across continents. Many carried stories they felt unable to share. The world was rebuilding, focused on recovery, prosperity, and political realignment. There was little space for prolonged confrontation with atrocity. Auschwitz-Birkenau existed in the background, acknowledged but not fully faced. Over time, however, a troubling pattern emerged. As eyewitnesses aged and passed away, voices began to question the facts. Some denied the scale of the killings. Others denied the existence of gas chambers entirely. A few reframed the camp as a labor facility distorted by propaganda. These claims did not arise from evidence, but from ideology, anti-Semitism, and a desire to erase accountability. Denial did not require truth. It required repetition. Auschwitz-Birkenau thus became a battleground of memory. Historians responded by deepening documentation. Survivor testimonies were recorded on film and preserved in archives. German records, railway schedules, architectural plans, and SS correspondence were meticulously analyzed. The ruins themselves were studied as forensic evidence, their layout and materials confirming what witnesses had long described. The camp spoke, even when survivors could no longer do so. Education became the central defense against forgetting. Museums and memorial institutions expanded their work, presenting Auschwitz-Birkenau not as an abstract symbol, but as a concrete system built and operated by human beings. Students walked through barracks. Visitors stood on the rail platform. The physicality of the place confronted denial with reality. Yet remembrance was not only about the past. Each generation brought new questions. How could ordinary people participate in mass murder? How did bureaucracy enable cruelty? What warnings were ignored before the catastrophe unfolded? Auschwitz-Birkenau was increasingly taught not only as history, but as a moral framework for understanding modern society. The camp also forced confrontation with complicity beyond Germany. Railways across Europe transported victims. Companies supplied materials. Governments closed borders to refugees. The story of Auschwitz-Birkenau expanded outward, revealing a network of decisions that made genocide possible. This broader understanding complicated remembrance. That it was easier to condemn distant perpetrators than to examine structures that still existed. National narratives often emphasized resistance over collaboration. Memory became selective, shaped by politics and identity as much as by evidence. Despite this, survivors continued to speak. They described small acts of kindness that preserve humanity amid horror. They recalled names of the dead so they would not vanish into statistics. Their testimonies resisted both denial and simplification, insisting on complexity without diminishing responsibility. And as time moved forward, Auschwitz-Birkenau took on an almost universal symbolic weight. IT became shorthand for absolute evil. While this recognition honored the victims, it also carried risk. When Auschwitz is treated as incomprehensible, it becomes distant. When it is seen as unique beyond comparison, its lessons are harder to apply elsewhere. Genocides after the Holocaust demonstrated this danger. Again and again, warning signs appeared. Again and again, the world hesitated. Auschwitz-Birkenau was invoked after the fact, rather than used as a guide for prevention. Memory without action proved insufficient. Preserving the site itself presented further challenges. Weather, age, and mass visitation threatened its structures. Conservation efforts faced ethical dilemmas. How much restoration is appropriate? At what point does preservation risk altering authenticity? Each decision carried weight because the site's credibility depended on its integrity. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not meant to comfort visitors, that IT was meant to confront them. Walking through the camp offered no narrative resolution. There was no redemption embedded in its design. The emptiness remained heavy, demanding reflection rather than closure. For descendants of victims, remembrance was personal. For descendants of perpetrators, it was often painful and conflicted. For those with no direct connection, it posed a question of responsibility. What does it mean to inherit a history you did not live, but must not forget? The answer, imperfect and evolving, lay in continued engagement. That Auschwitz-Birkenau survived attempts at destruction, denial, and neglect. Its endurance was not accidental. It remained because people chose to protect it, study it, and teach its lessons even when doing so was uncomfortable. The camp's legacy was not fixed in stone. That IT depended on human choices, just as its creation had to. In remembering Auschwitz-Birkenau, the goal was not only to honor the dead, but to recognize patterns that lead to dehumanization. Language, laws, silence, gradual normalization of cruelty. These were the early stages that history revealed in painful clarity. The past could not be changed, but its meaning could still shape the future. In the next chapter, we will turn to the final years of Auschwitz-Birkenau's existence as a living memory, examining how the camp's story continues to evolve today and why its relevance has not diminished with time, but grown more urgent as first-hand witnesses fade into history. Chapter 9, Segment 2, Teaching Auschwitz in a Changing World. As Auschwitz-Birkenau moved further into the past, the way it was taught became just as important as what was taught. Education emerged as the primary bridge between lived memory and inherited understanding, carrying the responsibility once held by survivors themselves. This transition reshaped how the camp was presented, questioned, and understood across generations. In the years immediately following the war, Holocaust education was limited and often fragmented. Many survivors did not speak publicly about their experiences, either because they were not asked or because the trauma was too great. In schools, the Holocaust was sometimes mentioned only briefly, folded into broader narratives of World War II without sustained examination. This began to change in the latter half of the 20th century as survivor testimony became more visible. Educators recognized that Auschwitz-Birkenau could not be explained through statistics alone. 6 million was a number too vast to comprehend. The camp demanded human stories, personal detail, and context that revealed how genocide unfolded step by step rather than all at once. Teaching Auschwitz required slowing down history. Rather than presenting the Holocaust as an inevitable outcome, Educators began tracing the incremental decisions that led to Birkenau's construction and operation. Laws excluding Jews from public life. Propaganda normalizing dehumanization. Administrative language that transformed murder into logistics. These elements made clear that genocide was not sudden, but built. This approach challenged students in uncomfortable ways that IT asked them to consider how ordinary people became participants. It raised questions about conformity, authority, and moral responsibility. It refused to isolate perpetrators as incomprehensible figures detached from society. Instead, it showed how systems functioned through cooperation, silence, and routine. That Auschwitz-Birkenau thus became a case study in human behavior under pressure. At the same time, educators faced the challenge of emotional balance. Teaching two clinically risked detachment. Teaching two emotionally risked, overwhelming students, or turning history into spectacle. The goal was not shock, but understanding grounded in respect. This balance became more complex as classrooms diversified. Students arrived with different cultural backgrounds, levels of prior knowledge, and personal connections to trauma. Some encountered the Holocaust as distant history. Others saw echoes of persecution within their own family narratives. Teaching Auschwitz-Birkenau required sensitivity without dilution. Language mattered deeply. Educators learned to avoid metaphors that blurred reality. Terms like factory of death, while evocative, could unintentionally depersonalize victims. Careful attention was paid to naming perpetrators, victims, and processes accurately, emphasizing agency and responsibility rather than abstraction. The role of place-based education also expanded. Visits to Auschwitz-Birkenau became integral for many students. Standing in Birkenau altered perception in ways no textbook could. The scale of the camp, the repetition of structures, and the emptiness of a landscape conveyed meaning beyond words. Yet even site visits raised questions. How much context should be provided beforehand? What behaviors were appropriate during visits? How could reflection be guided without prescribing emotion? Educators increasingly viewed Auschwitz-Birkenau not as a lesson with conclusions, but as a space for inquiry. Students were encouraged to ask difficult questions rather than receive definitive answers. Why did neighbors turn away? Why did resistance take the forms it did? What choices existed and which were foreclosed? As digital technology advanced, new tools emerged. Virtual tours, digitized archives, and recorded testimonies allowed access for those unable to visit physically. These tools expanded reach, but also introduced challenges. Screens could flatten experience. Algorithms could detach content from context. Educators had to actively frame digital materials to prevent misinterpretation. Another challenge arose from comparison. Students often asked whether Auschwitz was comparable to other atrocities. While comparison can deepen understanding, it can also obscure specificity. Educators learned to distinguish between drawing lessons and drawing equivalences, emphasizing that understanding one genocide does not require diminishing another. In recent years, Holocaust education has also faced external pressure. Political polarization, misinformation, and declining historical literacy have complicated teaching efforts. In some contexts, educators have encountered resistance, skepticism, or claims that the Holocaust is exaggerated or irrelevant. These challenges make clarity and evidence more essential than ever. That Auschwitz-Birkenau's documentation offers little ambiguity. The camp's history is supported by survivor testimony, perpetrator records, architectural plans, photographs, and forensic evidence. Teaching this history is not a matter of opinion, but of responsibility. At the same time, educators increasingly emphasize ethical reflection. What does Auschwitz demand of us today? How do we recognize early signs of dehumanization? What responsibilities accompany citizenship, speech, and participation? These questions do not produce easy answers. They are meant to remain open, guiding awareness rather than prescribing ideology. Auschwitz-Birkenau, when taught responsibly, becomes less about the past alone and more about moral vigilance in the present. As witnesses fade, education becomes the primary safeguard against forgetting. Not education as memorization, but education as engagement. Not lessons that end at the classroom door, but questions that follow students into their understanding of society, power, and responsibility. In the next segment, we will explore how Auschwitz-Birkenau is represented beyond classrooms, in media, culture, and public discourse, and how these representations shape collective memory in ways that are both powerful and precarious. Chapter 9, Segment 1. Auschwitz-Birkenau in the Modern World. In the decades since the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the camp has not remained frozen in time. While its physical structures largely stand as they were left in January 1945, its meaning has continued to evolve alongside the world that now surrounds it. Auschwitz-Birkenau exists today not only as a historical site, but as a living reference point within global conversations about memory, justice, human rights, and the limits of civilization. By the late 20th century, Auschwitz had become one of the most recognized symbols of the Holocaust worldwide. Its name alone carried weight, often invoked in discussions far removed from its physical location in southern Poland. Politicians referenced it, educators taught it, artists grappled with it. Yet this widespread recognition also introduced a paradox. The more Auschwitz was referenced, the greater the risk that its specificity would be diluted. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not an abstraction, that it was a functioning system, designed and maintained through deliberate human choices. Understanding it in the modern world required resisting the tendency to reduce it to metaphor alone. The challenge was to preserve the factual reality of what occurred there, while acknowledging its broader moral implications. One of the most significant developments in the post-war period was the internationalization of Holocaust remembrance. Auschwitz-Birkenau became a destination for visitors from across the globe. Heads of state, students, researchers, and descendants of victims walked through its gates. Each arrived with different expectations, cultural frameworks, and emotional responses. This diversity of engagement shaped how the site was interpreted. For some visitors, Auschwitz-Birkenau represented a specifically Jewish tragedy. For others, it symbolized the dangers of totalitarianism. For still others, it served as a warning about racism, nationalism, or bureaucratic violence. These interpretations were not mutually exclusive, but they required careful framing to avoid distortion. The camp's curators and educators faced an ongoing responsibility. They had to ensure that Auschwitz-Birkenau was presented accurately, grounded in evidence, and resistant to politicization. Exhibits were updated as new research emerged. Testimonies were contextualized. Language was carefully chosen to avoid sensationalism or simplification. At the same time, the site increasingly functioned as a space for reflection rather than instruction alone. Visitors often arrived already knowing the broad outlines of Holocaust history. What Auschwitz-Birkenau offered instead was confrontation with scale and proximity. The vastness of Birkenau, the repetition of barracks, the remnants of rail lines. These elements transformed abstract knowledge into something tangible. This encounter, however, raised difficult questions. How should people behave in a place of mass death? What forms of engagement are respectful? Where is the line between documentation and intrusion? As technology advanced, these questions became more complex. Smartphones and social media altered how memory was shared. Images from Auschwitz-Birkenau circulated globally, sometimes stripped of context. While documentation could spread awareness, it could also risk trivialization. The camp itself did not change. Human behavior around it did. Another modern challenge lay in competing narratives of history. As political climates shifted across Europe and beyond, debates emerged about national responsibility, victimhood, and collaboration. Auschwitz-Birkenau became entangled in these discussions, not because the facts were unclear, but because memory is never neutral. Some narratives emphasized resistance movements. Others focused on national suffering under occupation. While these perspectives were part of the broader wartime experience, they sometimes obscured the specific mechanisms of genocide that Auschwitz represented. Maintaining historical clarity required constant effort. Scholars continued to examine documents, reassess timelines, and refine understanding of how Auschwitz-Birkenau functioned within the larger Nazi system. Their work reinforced a central truth. The camp was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a coordinated, state-sponsored process that in the modern world. Auschwitz-Birkenau also influenced legal and ethical frameworks. Concepts such as crimes against humanity, genocide, and universal jurisdiction were shaped by the legacy of the Holocaust. International law evolved in response to what had been revealed. Tribunals, conventions, and human rights organizations all traced elements of their mandate back to the moral rupture Auschwitz represented. Yet law alone could not guarantee prevention. Despite Auschwitz, genocides occurred again, in different places, under different names, often with early warning signs that echoed the past. Each repetition raised the same question: what had remembrance actually achieved? This tension defined Auschwitz-Birkenau's role in the present. It stood as both evidence and challenge. Evidence of what had happened. Challenge to ensure it did not happen again. For younger generations, Auschwitz-Birkenau was increasingly encountered first through education rather than personal connection. Many students had no family ties to the events of the Holocaust. Their engagement depended entirely on how history was taught, framed, and contextualized. This made pedagogy crucial. Teaching Auschwitz required more than dates and statistics. It required helping students understand how ordinary institutions participated in extraordinary crimes, how prejudice escalated into policy, how exclusion became annihilation. Importantly, it also required resisting despair. Auschwitz-Birkenau confronted humanity with its capacity for destruction, but remembrance also highlighted resilience, resistance, and the survival of dignity under extreme conditions. These elements did not redeem the crime, but they preserve humanity within in the modern world. Auschwitz-Birkenau thus occupied a difficult space. That it was sacred but not religious, educational but not neutral, historical but not confined to the past. Its relevance persisted because the conditions that enabled it, fear, division, obedience, indifference, had not disappeared. As we move deeper into the present century, Auschwitz-Birkenau remains a reference point not because it is unique in horror, but because it reveals how horror becomes possible. Remembering it requires sustained attention, ethical discipline, and refusal to allow memory to harden into ritual alone. In the next segment, we will examine how Auschwitz-Birkenau is taught, challenged, and interpreted in contemporary society, and why its lessons remain contested even as its history becomes more distant in time. Chapter 9, Segment 3, Auschwitz in Media, Culture, and Collective Memory. As Auschwitz-Birkenau moved further from living memory and deeper into history, it increasingly entered the realm of culture. Books, films, documentaries, museums, memorial ceremonies, and public discourse all played roles in shaping how the camp was understood by those who never experienced the Holocaust firsthand. This expansion of representation carried both power and risk. Media became one of the most influential forces in how Auschwitz was remembered. Early representations of the Holocaust often struggled to find a language capable of conveying its scale without diminishing its gravity. Survivors who wrote memoirs faced skepticism. Some publishers feared audiences were not ready, or that the stories were too bleak. When accounts did appear, they were sometimes framed as exceptional tragedies rather than systemic crimes. Over time, this changed as survivor voices gained recognition. Their testimonies became foundational to Holocaust representation. Memoirs, interviews, and oral histories preserved personal experiences in detail that no archive alone could provide. These narratives resisted abstraction, grounding Auschwitz-Birkenau in lived reality rather than distant symbolism. Film and television followed. Dramatic portrayals reached audiences far beyond academic settings. For many people, their first encounter with Auschwitz was through cinema. These representations had the power to humanize victims and convey emotional truth, but they also introduced ethical dilemmas. How much dramatization was acceptable? Where did storytelling risk simplification or distortion? Auschwitz-Birkenau posed unique challenges for representation. Its horror was not episodic. It was industrial, repetitive, and systematic. Traditional narrative structures, heroes, climaxes, resolutions, often failed to capture this reality. Attempts to impose familiar storytelling arcs risked misunderstanding the nature of the crime. Some creators chose restraint. They avoided graphic imagery, focusing instead on atmosphere, absence, and implication. Others emphasized individual stories as a way to make the incomprehensible accessible. Both approaches had merit, but both required careful framing to avoid turning suffering into spectacle. Public memorials and commemorations also shaped collective memory. Ceremonies marking the liberation of Auschwitz, Holocaust Remembrance Day, and other anniversaries created shared moments of reflection. These events reinforced the camp's significance while offering spaces for mourning and acknowledgement. Yet ritualization carried its own risks. When remembrance becomes routine, it can lose urgency. Repetition without reflection can harden memory into formality. Auschwitz-Birkenau's challenge was to remain disturbing rather than familiar, instructive rather than ceremonial alone. In popular culture, Auschwitz was sometimes referenced metaphorically. Its name appeared in political rhetoric, debates, and commentary far removed from its historical context. While some uses aimed to warn against injustice, others diluted meaning by equating vastly different situations. This misuse revealed how symbols, once detached from history, could be reshaped to serve agendas unrelated to truth. Guarding against this required constant correction. Historians, educators, and institutions repeatedly emphasized that Auschwitz-Birkenau was not a metaphor for generic suffering. It was a specific place built for a specific purpose, targeting specific populations through documented processes. Precision mattered because distortion often began with vagueness. Digital media further complicated memory. Online platforms allowed unprecedented access to historical materials, but they also accelerated misinformation. Holocaust, denial, and distortion found new audiences through algorithms that rewarded controversy over accuracy. Images and quotes circulated without context, sometimes stripped of meaning entirely. Countering this required active engagement. Institutions expanded digital archives, provided educational resources, and responded publicly to false claims. Survivors recorded testimonies for virtual preservation, ensuring that future generations could still hear their voices even after their passing. At the same time, younger generations engaged with Auschwitz-Birkenau through new forms of expression, art, literature, and multimedia projects reflected contemporary concerns while grappling with historical responsibility. These works demonstrated that remembrance was not static. It evolved as each generation asked its own questions of the past. Some works focused on silence. They explored what could not be said, what remained unknowable, and how absence itself communicated loss. Others examined intergenerational trauma, showing how Auschwitz's legacy shaped lives long after liberation. These cultural responses did not replace historical study. They complemented it. Together, they formed a layered memory, one that combined evidence, testimony, reflection, and moral inquiry. Auschwitz-Birkenau's place in culture thus became both a safeguard and a test. It revealed how societies chose to remember, reinterpret, or sometimes avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. One of the most significant developments in recent years was the recognition that memory is not guaranteed. As misinformation spreads and attention fragments, remembrance requires effort. It must be renewed through education, scholarship, and ethical representation. Auschwitz-Birkenau does not persist automatically. It persists because people choose to keep its history visible and accurate. The camp's presence in culture ultimately reflects collective values. Whether Auschwitz is treated with seriousness or trivialized reveals how societies understand responsibility, truth, and human dignity. Memory is not only about honoring the past. It is about shaping the moral boundaries of the present. Auschwitz-Birkenau stands at the center of this process, not as a story to be consumed, but as a reality to be confronted. Its representation in media and culture must remain anchored in respect for victims and fidelity to evidence. Anything less risks turning remembrance into performance rather than warning. In the final chapter, we will step back and reflect on Auschwitz-Birkenau as a whole, considering what it reveals about humanity, what it demands of memory, and why its lessons remain essential as history recedes and responsibility passes to those who were not there, but must remember. Chapter 10, Segment 1. What Auschwitz-Birkenau reveals about humanity. Auschwitz-Birkenau stands as more than a historical site. It is a lens through which humanity must examine itself, not because it represents the only atrocity in history, but because it exposes how ordinary structures, bureaucracy, technology, obedience, and ideology can be assembled into a system capable of absolute destruction. The camp did not emerge from chaos. It emerged from order. Every aspect of Auschwitz-Birkenau was designed, approved, documented, and maintained. Architects drew plans. Engineers calculated capacity. Clerks recorded arrivals. Guards followed schedules. Trains ran on time. Violence was not random. It was regulated. This reality forces a difficult recognition. Genocide does not require madness. It can arise from normality when morality is removed from decision-making. This is one of Auschwitz's most unsettling lessons. The individuals who operated the camp were not monsters in appearance. They were neighbors, parents, professionals. Many returned home after their shifts, ate dinner with families, listened to music, and slept. The separation between daily life and mass murder was maintained through language, routine, and distance from consequences. Auschwitz shows how dehumanization functions. Victims were reduced to categories, numbers, and logistical problems. Once people are transformed into abstractions, harm becomes easier to justify. This process did not begin at the camp gates. It began with words, laws, and images that framed certain groups as dangerous, inferior, or expendable. The camp reveals how quickly moral boundaries can erode. Small compromises accumulate. Silence becomes participation. Obedience replaces responsibility. Each step may appear insignificant, but together they construct systems that no individual feels responsible for, yet everyone sustains. Auschwitz also challenges the notion that progress alone prevents atrocity. The camp existed in one of the most scientifically and culturally advanced regions of Europe. Education, art, and technology did not prevent genocide. In some cases, they facilitated it. This forces a reconsideration of assumptions about civilization and morality. Advancement without ethical grounding does not guarantee humanity. At the same time, Auschwitz-Birkenau reveals resilience. Despite overwhelming conditions, prisoners formed bonds, shared food, preserved language, and protected one another when possible. Acts of kindness, however small, persisted within a system designed to extinguish them. Resistance did not always take the form of rebellion. Often it was survival itself. Memory itself becomes a form of resistance. Survivors who testified broke the intended silence of the camp. The Nazis attempted to erase evidence, destroy records, and eliminate witnesses. The existence of detailed historical knowledge today stands in direct opposition to those efforts. Each preserved name, each recovered document, each recorded testimony is a refusal to let annihilation succeed fully. Auschwitz also exposes the limits of comprehension. No description can fully convey the experience of those who were there. Language reaches its boundary. Numbers overwhelm understanding. This gap between knowledge and experience must be acknowledged honestly. Education does not aim to replicate suffering, but to recognize its reality without distortion. Importantly, Auschwitz-Birkenau demands responsibility rather than guilt. The lessons of the camp are not inherited blame, but inherited obligation. Obligation to recognize early warning signs. Obligation to resist dehumanization. Obligation to question authority when it violates fundamental dignity. This responsibility extends beyond any single group. Auschwitz is a Jewish tragedy, a Roma tragedy, a Polish tragedy, a human tragedy. Its victims came from many backgrounds, but the mechanisms that enable their destruction are universal. The camp warns not about one nation alone, but about the conditions under which any society can descend into organized cruelty. The danger lies not only in hatred, but in indifference. Auschwitz was possible because many people did not act. Some did not know. Some did not want to know. Some believed it was not their concern. The camp teaches that absence of action can be as consequential as direct participation in the present. Auschwitz-Birkenau remains a moral reference point. When societies debate who belongs, whose lives matter, and which truths are inconvenient, the camp's history offers clarity. It shows where unchecked exclusion leads. It reveals how quickly norms can shift when fear overrides empathy. This is why Auschwitz-Birkenau must be studied with care and humility, not as a relic, not as a symbol used for argument, but as evidence. Evidence of what occurred. Evidence of how it occurred. Evidence of what must be prevented. In the next segment, we will conclude this documentary by reflecting on remembrance itself, why memory is fragile, how it can fail, and what it means to carry the responsibility of Auschwitz-Birkenau into a future shaped by people who were not there, but who must remember. Chapter 10, Segment 2. The fragility of memory and the responsibility to remember. As time moves forward, Auschwitz-Birkenau does not fade because its history is unclear. It fades because memory, by its nature, is fragile. Memory depends on people. When witnesses are gone, remembrance must be actively sustained or it slowly erodes under distance, distraction, and denial. For decades, survivors carried the weight of memory themselves. They spoke in classrooms, courtrooms, and public halls. They answered questions that reopened wounds. They returned to the places where they had lost families, names, and identities. Their presence made the Holocaust undeniable because it was personal, immediate, and embodied. Now, that era is ending. The last survivors are aging. Many have already passed. Their voices remain through recordings, transcripts, and archives, but the living connection is changing. Memory is shifting from lived experience to inherited responsibility. This transition is dangerous and necessary at the same time. Dangerous because distance invites distortion. Necessary because history must survive beyond those who lived it. The question is not whether memory will change, but how it will be carried forward. Auschwitz-Birkenau presents a unique challenge in this regard. Its scale defies intuition. Its purpose resists comprehension. As the camp becomes more distant in time, there is a temptation to simplify it into symbols or slogans. While symbols can preserve attention, they can also flatten complexity. Memory must resist simplification. Auschwitz was not one event. It was a process. It evolved over years, adapted to circumstances, and relied on countless decisions by individuals at every level. Forgetting this complexity makes it easier to believe that such crimes belong only to the past or to exceptional circumstances. Another threat to memory is normalization. When images of Auschwitz appear frequently without context, they can lose their impact. Barbed wire, barracks, and watchtowers become familiar visuals rather than warnings. Repetition without reflection dulls moral response. This is why remembrance must be active rather than passive. Active remembrance asks questions. It examines causes. It challenges assumptions. It does not merely recall that atrocities happened, but investigates how societies allowed them to happen and how similar patterns might reemerge under different conditions. Denial and distortion exploit passivity. Holocaust denial rarely announces itself openly. More often, it appears as doubt, minimization, or selective omission. It questions numbers, motives, or intent. It reframes genocide as tragedy without perpetrators or as collateral damage of war. Auschwitz-Birkenau's documentation makes such claims unsustainable. The camp's history is supported by survivor testimony, Nazi records, photographs, architectural plans, and forensic evidence. Denial persists not because evidence is lacking, but because attention is memory, therefore requires vigilance. Institutions, educators, and individuals share responsibility for preserving accuracy. This includes correcting misinformation, contextualizing images, and resisting the misuse of Auschwitz as a rhetorical device disconnected from history. Remembrance also involves ethical humility. No one can fully understand the experience of those who were imprisoned or murdered at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Acknowledging this limit is part of respectful memory. The goal is not to imagine oneself in their place, but to honor their reality without appropriation or comparison. This humility extends to how stories are told. Sensationalism undermines understanding. Overexposure to graphic detail risks desensitization. Conversely, avoiding discomfort entirely risks erasure. Responsible remembrance navigates between these extremes, maintaining clarity without spectacle. Memory also requires continuity. Each generation must reinterpret Auschwitz-Birkenau in light of its own challenges, without altering historical truth. The camp's lessons are not static. They speak differently in different contexts, but they do not change. This continuity depends on education, but also on culture, policy, and public discourse. When leaders speak about history responsibly, memory is reinforced. When they exploit or dismiss it, memory weakens. Auschwitz-Birkenau's legacy is shaped not only by historians, but by how societies choose to reference or ignore it. Remembrance is not neutral. Remember Auschwitz-Birkenau accurately is to confront uncomfortable truths about power, obedience, and exclusion. It challenges narratives of innocence and progress. It forces recognition that genocide is not an anomaly outside history, but a possibility within it. This recognition is not meant to paralyze, that it is meant to sharpen awareness, to cultivate attention to language that dehumanizes, to notice policies that exclude, to recognize when fear is used to justify harm. Auschwitz teaches that these patterns do not announce themselves as evil. They present themselves as necessary. The responsibility of memory, then, is not to dwell in despair. It is to remain alert. As the physical structures of Birkenau, weather, and the voices of survivors fall silent, remembrance must be carried by choice rather than proximity. Each act of learning, teaching, and correcting falsehood becomes part of a chain that links the past to the present. In the final segment, we will reflect on Auschwitz-Birkenau as a memorial and warning, considering why its history must be preserved not only as a record of what happened, but as guidance for how societies must act when confronted with injustice, exclusion, and the erosion of human dignity. Chapter 10, Segment 3. Auschwitz-Birkenau as Memorial, Warning, and Moral Boundary. Auschwitz-Birkenau exists today not only as a preserved site, but as a moral boundary drawn across history. It marks a line that humanity crossed, and one it must never cross again. As a memorial, it honors the victims. As a warning, it confronts the living. And as a historical record, it stands against forgetting, denial, and distortion. Walking through Birkenau today, the silence is striking. The barracks stretch across the landscape in long, repeating rows. Chimneys stand where buildings once held thousands of people. The rail line ends abruptly near the ruins of the Crematoria. The scale is overwhelming, yet the emptiness is just as powerful. This contrast reflects the purpose of the memorial, to show absence, not spectacle. Birkenau does not attempt to recreate suffering. There are no reenactments, no dramatizations, no artificial effects. What remains is what could not be erased: ruins, foundations, remnants of infrastructure. These fragments speak quietly, demanding attention rather than commanding it. The site asks visitors to slow down, to observe, and to reflect. In memorial, Auschwitz-Birkenau restores individuality to those who were stripped of it. Names, photographs, shoes, suitcases, and personal items preserved in museums counteract the Nazis' attempt to reduce people to numbers. Each artifact represents a life interrupted, a future denied. Together, they resist the abstraction that genocide relies upon. The memorial also acknowledges complexity, that it does not present history as simple or comforting. It includes the roles of perpetrators, collaborators, bystanders, and resistors. It documents not only murder, but the systems that enabled it. This honesty is essential. Sanitized memory is a form of forgetting. A warning. Auschwitz-Birkenau speaks beyond its time. That it demonstrates how quickly societies can normalize exclusion, how bureaucracy can mask violence, how language can prepare the ground for atrocity. These lessons are not confined to the 20th century. They apply wherever power is unchecked and humanity is divided into categories of worth. The warning is not abstract, that it is grounded in evidence, in decisions recorded on paper, in policies debated and implemented, in ordinary people performing extraordinary harm because they believe it was required, justified, or unavoidable. Auschwitz shows that genocide is not inevitable. The it is constructed. And because it is constructed, it can be prevented. Prevention begins long before violence. It begins with resisting dehumanization, questioning authority, protecting minority rights, and maintaining moral clarity when fear and convenience tempt compromise. The memorial, therefore, serves as an ethical reference point. When societies debate who belongs, whose lives matter, and which truths are inconvenient, Auschwitz-Birkenau offers perspective. It shows the endpoint of unchecked exclusion. It reminds us that dignity is not divisible, and that rights denied to some are ultimately threatened for all. Preserving Auschwitz-Birkenau is itself an act of responsibility. The site requires constant care. Buildings decay, materials weather. Preservation involves choices about what to restore, what to leave as ruins, and how to present history without altering it. Each decision reflects a commitment to truth rather than comfort. This responsibility extends beyond physical preservation. It includes protecting the integrity of the narrative, ensuring that the camp is not misused for political purposes, preventing trivialization, challenging denial wherever it appears. These efforts are ongoing because memory does not defend itself. Auschwitz-Birkenau also forces a confrontation with limits. An memorial can fully convey the experience of those who suffered and died there. No visit can substitute for lived reality. Acknowledging this limitation is part of respectful remembrance. The goal is not to feel what victims felt, but to recognize that it happened and that it matters. This recognition carries obligations that learn accurately, speak carefully, act when dehumanization appears. Remembering Auschwitz is not passive. It is an active stance against indifference. For future generations, the challenge will be sustaining this stance without proximity to witnesses. The responsibility will rest increasingly on institutions, educators, families, and individuals who choose to carry the history forward. That choice matters. History shows that forgetting does not occur all at once. It happens gradually, through neglect, distraction, and distortion. Auschwitz-Birkenau remains relevant precisely because it resists this process. It insists on attention, as long as the site stands. It asks the same questions of each visitor, each reader, each listener. What do you do when others are dehumanized? What do you accept in the name of order or security? What lines will you refuse to cross? These questions do not have final answers. They must be asked repeatedly, in different contexts, by different generations. Auschwitz-Birkenau does not offer redemption. It offers responsibility. Responsibility to remember the victims as individuals. Responsibility to preserve truth against distortion. Responsibility to recognize the conditions that allow cruelty to become systematized. In this way, the camp remains not only a place of mourning, but a place of moral clarity. The Holocaust cannot be undone. The lives lost cannot be restored. But the future is still shaped by choices that Auschwitz-Birkenau endures to remind us of that fact. Not as a symbol to be invoked lightly, not as history to be consumed and forgotten, but as evidence of what happened, why it happened, and what must never be allowed to happen again. This concludes our examination of Auschwitz-Birkenau, not as an ending, but as a commitment to memory, responsibility, and vigilance in a world that still needs all three. Final outro. As we come to the end of this documentary, we do not close a chapter of history. We acknowledge a responsibility. Auschwitz-Birkenau is not a story meant to fade when the narration ends. It is a truth that must remain present, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is painful. The people who were murdered, they were not symbols. They were lives, families, names, futures that were stolen. Remembering them is not an act of guilt. It is an act of respect. Understanding how Auschwitz was built, step by step, decision by decision, helps us recognize how fragile humanity can be when empathy is replaced by obedience, when people are reduced to categories, and when silence becomes easier than resistance. History does not repeat itself in the same form. But the conditions that allow cruelty to grow can return quietly, gradually, and often unnoticed. That is why remembrance matters, not to dwell in darkness, but to protect the light, not to relive suffering, but to prevent it, not to look away, but to stay aware. Thank you for listening with care and patience. That if this documentary helped you reflect, learn, or remember, consider sharing it so these stories continue to be told. And if you find value in calm, thoughtful historical documentaries like this, you are welcome to stay with us for more. For now, take a moment, breathe, and remember, never again.